פעמים שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים חמי מצות הלילה הזה כולו מצות הלילה הזה כולו מצות שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים שאור ירוקות שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים שאור ירוקות הלילה הזה מורוי הלילה הזה מורוי שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים בין יושבים ובין מסובים שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים בין יושבים ובין מסובים הלילה הזה כולנו מסובים הלילה הזה כולנו מסובים עבדים היינו בפרעי במצרים עבדים היינו בפרעי במצרים עבדים היינו בפרעי במצרים ברוך המקום ברוך שנוסן תוירו ברוך שנוסן תוירו לימון ישראל ברוך המקום ברוך שנוסן תוירו לימון ישראל ברוך
ויהי שיום זאת
ויהי שיום זאת לאבותינו ולנו שלא יחד בלבד עומד עלינו לחלוצנו אלא שבכל דור ודור עומדים עלינו לחלוצנו והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידם אלא שבכל דור ודור עומדים עלינו לחלוצנו אלא שבכל דור ודור עומדים עלינו לחלוצנו עומדים עלינו לחלוצנו והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידם והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידם He Yanda, Lavoy Seino Velano, Yanda, Lavoy Seino Velano, Sheloyach the Bilevan, O Madaleno Lachalo Seino, Sheloyach the Bilevan, O Madaleno Lachalo Seino, Ella Shebechol de Vadoin, I'm the Maleno Lachalo Seino, Ella Shebechol de Vadoin. I'm the Malena Lachalo Seino, Behakodosh Baruch Hu, Matzileinu Miyodam, Behakodosh Baruch Hu, Matzileinu Miyodam. Ilo Hitziano mi Mitzrayim velo Yosavahem Shvatim Da'yenu Ilo Osavahem Shvatim velo Yosav Elokehem velo Yosav Elokehem Da'yenu Ilo Osav Elokehem velo Horagis Chayrehem Da'yenu Ilo Holox Chayrehem velo Sanlano Esmamaino Da'yenu
Allah has
Al-Achas, Kama v'chama, Toivak Fula Chopelus Amokim Aleinu. Al-Achas, Kama v'chama, Toivak Fula Chopelus Amokim Aleinu. Shoitzionu Mimitzayim, Shoitzionu Mimitzayim. Yam, Yam, Beis Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, Beis Yaakov me'am loyez, Hoysa Yehuda leKadisha Yisrael amam shelo Yisrael, Hayam erav hayam nois, Hayardein Yisrael liyochoy, Hehorim. Raktu chaylim gevavos kivnei yitzay Malcho hayam kisanos Hayardein tisoy v'yochoy Hehorim tirkidu chaylim gevavos kivnei yitzay Yivifnei odoim chuli aretz Mi yivifnei Eloi hayakoy Ahoy tchi atzot agamoyim Chalom ish l'maynoy mayem Yisrael b'tach Hashem Ezra Maginam Ho Beis bitcho b'Hashem Ezra Momaginam Yirei Hashem bitcho b'Hashem Ezra Momaginam Yirei Hashem bitcho b'Hashem Ezra Momaginam Yivorech es Beis Yisrael Yivorech es Beis Aharon Yivorech Yirei Hashem Haktanim im Adoilim Yosef Hashem Aleichem Aleichem v'yal b'neichem Beruchim atem LaHashem Oisei Shomayim v'oretz HaShomayim Shomayim LaHashem V'oretz nasan libnei Yodom Lo yamesim yehalelu kol Ve'lo kol yoyidei duma V'anachnu nevarech kol Ne'yato v'yado ilam Tirirayayayam Hallelujah
שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ, אל ייתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך, הנה לא ינום ולא ישן שומר ישראל, השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה וירח בלילה, השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, השם ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם. שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ, אל ייתן למות.
Okay, Chag Sameach, everybody. Welcome to the World Alliance of Qara'im, Hag HaMazoth Q A. I am Hakham Melech ben Yaakov of the World Alliance of Qara'im, and I hope you've come with your questions, and I hope we can provide some answers. We will certainly try. So we usually do our Shabbat Torah study, and it usually lasts about 3 hours or so. I'm going to do this one a little bit shorter, I think, and it'll probably last around maybe 1.5 to 2 hours. That's the plan anyway. We'll see what happens. So for those of you who are new here, I see there are a couple of new people here. So we as Karaites, in case you don't know already, we go according to the biblical, what we're calling the biblical calendar. So basically we go according to the actual new moon observation, rather than what the rabbis do, which is they go according to a calculated calendar, usually called the calendar of Hillel II, which was instituted in the 4th century CE, which attempts more or less to predict when the new moon is going to be visible. But both by design and by flaws in the calendar, it can be off by as much as 2 days. I think in some rare cases 3 days, but it could be either right on target, it can be off by 1 day, or it can be off by 2 days. In this case, we as Karaites have started our Hag HaMazoth, our Passover, 1 day after the rabbinical Jews, 1 day after the Rabbinites, because on the day that the Rabbinites this year declared a new month, when they declared Rosh Chodesh, the Rosh Chodesh of Nisan, if you were to go outside and look up in the sky, you would not see the moon anywhere. The moon would not have been visible on that day, which is pretty unfortunate to say the least. And so Karaites for centuries have been going by the actual observation of the new moon. We send searchers out, we send observers out at each evening when it's possible to see a new moon. And hold on a second, let me just take care of one technical thing here. And if the new moon is observed, then that evening is declared the beginning of the new month. And if it's not, then the following evening is declared the beginning of the new month for a maximum of the way it's traditionally been done is a maximum month length can be 30 days, because what's called the synodic period of the moon is 29 and a half days. We're not going to get into all the details here. Okay, so that being said, we also declare the new year based on the Aviv. Each springtime, we send searchers out. We send searchers out around the land of Israel to look for what's called the Aviv barley. The Aviv barley is a certain stage in the ripeness of the barley, which is not quite ripe, but a little bit, about 2 weeks before total ripeness, when the barley seed becomes hard. And this is based on the plague of hail in Exodus 9, I believe it is, if I'm not mistaken, where it speaks about how the hail was able to destroy the barley because it was Aviv, and it was not able to destroy the spelt or the wheat because it was not yet in this later stage of ripeness. The hail was able to knock over the barley because it was already standing upright. Basically, the seeds were starting to become ripe, and we know that the Israelites exited Egypt in the month of the Aviv, and that we are to keep the Passover each year in the month of the Aviv. So putting everything together, that's what Karaites have traditionally done. Gone out each spring, look for this Aviv barley, this almost ripe barley, and once they find it in enough abundance in the land of Israel, then that following new moon, the next new moon after that, is then declared the month of the Aviv, the new moon of the Aviv, and that's how we start the new year. So everything is done by observation rather than calculation. The rabbinical calendar of calculation, the Hillel II calendar, it's fascinating. Actually, it really is a fascinating piece of work. It's essentially adopted from the later Babylonian calendar, has a lot of elements of the later Babylonian calendar, takes into account Greek astronomy, Babylonian astronomy, and it essentially attempts to predict more or less, doesn't make any attempt actually to hit the new month, the observable new moon right on the head, or hit the nail right on the head each month. It attempts to average around the observable new moon, but there's something called calendrical drift, which is present in any calendar calculation. There's no such thing as a calendar that's perfect. It will always drift. And the calendar, the Hillel II, or the rabbinical calendar, has drifted over the years. I won't get into the details how exactly, but what I will point out is that many years ago we wrote an article in Your Jerusalem. For those of you who are new here, Your Jerusalem was a newspaper that I printed physically in Jerusalem. We distributed about 20,000 copies per edition, and since we stopped printing it, I've put it on the web. And over the years, I've paid sometimes more attention to it, sometimes less attention to it. Lately, I've been trying to pay a bit more attention to it and put a lot of new content out there. But I will point you to the article that speaks about speaks about the calendrical drift. Just give me 1 second here and I'll find it. And actually, which was one of the articles that really got me into Charism. This article was printed back in 1999, a while ago. But this is through connections that I made through this article, specifically through getting to know Bruce Brill, the one who basically came up with the idea for the article and co-wrote it with me. I was then introduced to the Karaite community in Jerusalem, and make a long story short, that's how I became a Karaite. Before that, I had been learning in Orthodox yeshivas in Jerusalem. I grew up, since I guess the question was raised by a couple of people here, I grew up as in the suburbs of New York as a Ashkenazi Jew, with my parents belonged to a conservative synagogue in the suburbs of New York and Queens. And so I grew up with a very Jewish identity, but really didn't have very much interest in Judaism. My main interest in Judaism was trying to find interesting ways to escape Hebrew school, which we had 3 times a week, such as jumping out windows, hiding in bathrooms, stuff like that. The only part of Hebrew school I liked was on Sunday afternoons after the class, after the 2-hour boring as heck class, even though the rabbis were very nice, was eating the bagels and lox that they let us eat that were left over from the men's club down in the basement of the synagogue. That was really the only part of Hebrew school that I really liked. That and maybe a couple of Bible stories. Anyway, I'm not going to get into my history and my background right now, but what I will do is I will publish the link here to that article. So if you want to get some more information about some of the differences between the rabbinical and the Karaite, or what we call the biblical calendar, then you can take a look at this article. It's very colloquially written. It's not too technical, a little bit of technical information in there, but it's not too technical. It's designed to be written for a kind of general audience. So take a look at that, and maybe I'll post it up here for a second. There we go. Okay, so you can take a look at that, and you can take a look at the newspaper, Your Jerusalem in general. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to do a Q&A, and on Passover, okay? And I think I want to do a focus on, because a lot of questions that have come up, both private messages and on the World Alliance of Qara'im WhatsApp group. And if you don't belong to the World Alliance of Qara'im WhatsApp group, you should. You could see in the advertisement for the study, if you look at the Connect with Us links, one of them is the World Alliance of Qara'im WhatsApp group. Excuse me, WhatsApp group. And if you don't belong to it, you're definitely welcome to join. And we have a lot of good, interesting, sometimes vigorous, but usually almost always respectful and polite discussions on that group. So that being said, so the question that seems to have come up the most this year is regarding exactly what is forbidden on Passover. In other words, the Torah tells us that chametz is forbidden, that seor is forbidden, that machmetzet is forbidden. Those are the 3 words that are used. Okay, what do they mean? What are we not allowed to have in our houses on Passover? What are we not allowed to eat on Passover? And why is there so much confusion? Okay, so we can focus on that, and maybe I'll kind of like go through this document that I think Ariella was kind enough to post on the World Alliance of Qara'im WhatsApp group yesterday that speaks about some of these issues, and we'll also take a look directly in the Torah. But those are the 3 things that are forbidden on Passover: chametz, machmetzet, seor. And there is Phil. Welcome, Phil. Okay, so those are the 3 things that are forbidden. And what do they mean? Okay, well, I could, I guess, create a lot of suspense and build up the whole thing, but let me just tell you what I believe they mean. Okay, so, and I'll tell you what some of the different opinions are as well. So chametz is leavened bread. That means dough that a concentrated leavening agent has been added to, what we would call yeast today. But in ancient times, there was no such things. You didn't go to the Piggly Wiggly and pick up a package of yeast. What you did is you used sourdough starter. So if anyone has ever made sourdough bread, then you have a sourdough starter. You save a little bit of the dough to use as the sourdough starter for the next batch, and so on and so forth, right? You're just always rolling it forward. You're always kind of paying it forward, right? So that is chametz. Chametz is dough to which concentrated leavening agent is added, what we would call yeast in this day and age, and that causes the dough to rise. That's baked, and boom, there you have chametz. That's leavened bread. What is then machmetzet? Well, let's save machmetzet for last. What is then seor? So seor is the other thing that's forbidden, and we're going to see this in the Torah in Exodus in chapter 13 and in a couple of other places that we'll reference. Seor is usually translated as leaven or leavening agent or concentrated leavening agent. Essentially what it is sourdough starter. So it's concentrated leavening agent. Now the word sour, the English word sour, can be traced back to the Hebrew word, the biblical Hebrew word seor, sour. You can actually trace it back through the Romance languages, through Latin, back to the Greek. Then it jumps back to the Semitic languages, Aramaic and Hebrew. Okay, so it's an easy way to remember what seor is. Seor is sour dough starter. Seor, sourdough starter. That's what it is. So concentrated leavening agent / sourdough starter is the other thing that's mentioned in the Torah that is forbidden. And we'll talk about that in more detail. And then the third thing is something called machmetzet. So if you look at the word machmetzet, machmetzet sounds like chametz, machmetzet, okay? Just looking at the comments here, okay? I'm going to ignore the comments for now because I just want to focus on this. So chametz and machmetzet sound the same, right? In fact, chametz is, the word machmetzet is basically the word chametz with a mem before it and a tuf at the end. Chametz, machmetzet. Chametz, machmetzet. You can hear the same chametz root there. Now, what is machmetzet? In my strong opinion, in fact, I'm pretty much 100% convinced, machmetzet is just another word for chametz. In other words, it's just another way that the Torah says leavened bread. So why does the Torah use two different words for leavened bread? Because that's the way the Torah works. The Torah sometimes will use different words to express the same concept, just because one word fits a little bit better with the flow of the verse, or the two different words are meant to kind of triangulate onto the concept that's being explained in the Torah, and that's what's happening here. And I'm gonna bring a proof afterwards that shows that when you take this form, okay, when you take a word and you add a mem to it at the beginning and a tuf to it at the end, a tuf is a t sound to the end, then it does not change the meaning of the word. We'll take a look at that. So machmetzet is the same as chametz. Okay, why is this so important? Because the traditional, quote unquote, the Egyptian Karaites, they believe that machmetzet means something different. They believe that machmetzet means fermented foods, and so therefore they forbid fermented foods on Hag HaMazoth, on Passover. Okay, what the heck is going on here? Okay. Should we call you, should we salute you, Lieutenant Gregory Stevens? All right. At any rate, guys, please try to keep it polite. I don't know what's going on there in the comments, but we really like to keep things, friendly, polite. Okay. At any rate, so machmetzet, according to the Egyptian Karaites, or the traditional Karaites, machmetzet means fermented foods. In fact, I'm just going to flip out of the comments here. I don't even want to look at them right now. Okay. Machmetzet, according to the Egyptian Karaites, means fermented foods. So they say that all fermented foods are forbidden on Hag HaMazoth, on Passover. Okay, so they would forbid things like wine, because wine is fermented; vinegar, because vinegar is fermented; cheese, because many cheeses, not all, but many cheeses, aged cheeses, are fermented. I heard someone say yesterday that now there are some Karaites that are not using mayonnaise because mayonnaise traditionally contains vinegar in it. Vinegar is usually added to the egg before the oil is added because it gives it a little bit of flavor, and it also kind of emulsifies the egg. So when you add the oil, everything emulsifies nicely together. So anything that would be fermented is sauerkraut, kimchi. Anything that's fermented would be things that the Egyptian Karaites are forbidden. Okay, I'm going to say straight out that this is incorrect. In fact, it's ridiculous. I defy anyone to tell me what fermented foods have anything to do whatsoever with Passover, with Hag HaMazoth. It's not called Chag HaFermented Foods. It's called Hag HaMazoth. And there's a backstory to the reason that it's called Hag HaMazoth. Okay, we know that the Israelites, when they exited the land of Egypt, as we'll see in Exodus chapter 12, when they exited the land of Egypt, they didn't have enough time to allow their bread to rise. And so when they got out into the desert, they ate matzot. They ate unleavened bread. Okay, so that's the backstory for why we celebrate Hag HaMazoth, why we are not allowed to eat leavened bread on Passover, on quote unquote Passover. And why do I say quote unquote Passover? Because the word Passover is usually used incorrectly by most people. Passover is not the name of the 7-day holiday. There is one place where it is called Chag Pesach, where it is called the holiday of Passover, but almost always it's called Hag HaMazoth, the festival of unleavened bread. It follows the Pesach. Whenever the Torah refers to the Pesach, what it's talking about is the Passover offering that is brought right before the beginning of the festival of unleavened bread, Hag HaMazoth. So to make that distinction, I will always try to be accurate, and I'll always, when I say the word Passover or Pesach, that's referring to the Passover sacrifice. And when I say the word Hag HaMazoth or the festival of unleavened bread, that's referring to the 7-day holiday that follows the Passover sacrifice, in which we are forbidden to eat any leavened bread. Okay, so with that being said, let's dig in. Let me share the screen here, and let's dig in. Okay, so share screen, window. Boom. There we go. And we'll bring up the Torah, and I'll bring up some of the other commentaries that we usually use afterwards as need be. But for now, we're going to start in the Torah. We'll start in Exodus chapter 12. And we'll go into the Hebrew, of course, but let's just see where I want to start. So let's start right here at the beginning of Exodus chapter 12. I'm gonna, as we always do, I'm gonna go to the Hebrew, but follow along. If your Hebrew is still in the learning stages, and I recommend that everybody learn biblical Hebrew as much as possible. But if you're still in the learning stages with that, then follow along in English or follow along with a parallel page. In other words, English and Hebrew side by side, or any other language that you wish. Okay. All right. So we're here in Exodus chapter 12, and we're in verse 1. Okay. Wayomer Yahweh el Moshe wa el Aharon be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. So Yahweh said to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt to say, or saying, החודש הזה לכם ראש חודשים, ראשון הוא לכם לחדשי השנה. So this month for you, in other words, the month that you're going out of the land of Egypt, this defines the new year. החודש הזה לכם, this month is for you Rosh Chodeshim, the head of the months. Rishon hu lechem lechodshei hashana. It is the first for you among or of the months of the year. So this clearly defines that for us, Karaite Jews, for us, excuse me, biblical Jews, I should go grab some water, but for us biblical Jews, there is the Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah does not fall in the fall. It does not autumn in the autumn. It doesn't fall in the autumn. That is invented by the rabbis. That is false. The new year starts in the spring. The same month that we exited from Egypt, that is the month that is the first month of the new year. And every single place throughout the entire Tanakh that months are spoken about, they're always counted from the new year that begins in the spring. So if a prophet says, I had a vision on the 5th day of the 6th month, it means the 5th day of the 6th month, counting from the new year that begins in the springtime, that begins in the month that Israel exited from Egypt. And doesn't this make a lot more sense? Doesn't this make a lot more sense than starting the year in the autumn, starting the year in the fall? Okay, because first of all, it's springtime. Springtime means renewal. And typically, not all societies, but many societies, they began their New Year's in the spring or right before the spring. Even if you look at the secular, the civil New Year, when does it begin? It begins in what we call January. Okay, January is dead winter, so actually it's more associated with the winter solstice. But nonetheless, it begins right after the winter solstice, which basically means it's a lead up, or it's a kind of a harbinger for the springtime that's to come. And traditional societies, they would begin their years in the springtime because that's naturally when the year begins, especially for traditional societies, which are agricultural societies, whether they were planting crops or whether they were raising animals. Then naturally the new year, the new agricultural year would be in the springtime, not in the fall, not in the winter, not in the summer. Because even if you're raising animals, we know that the new animals are generally born in the springtime. Okay, why are the animals born in the springtime? The main reason that the animals are born in the springtime is because if they're at that time, these baby animals, which are very fragile, that's going to give them the maximum amount of time with warm weather before they have to essentially deal with the cold weather. So by the time the cold weather comes, 6 or 7 or 8 months later, then they're grown up enough to be able to withstand the cold weather. Imagine if animals, and I can't say that no animals are born in the fall. I don't know. I'm not. I'm not an expert in every single species of animals, but most animals that I know of, mammals, the young are born in the springtime, because the idea is that by the time the cold weather comes 6 or 7 or 8 months later, then they're hardened off enough, they're grown up enough to be able to withstand the cold weather. So naturally, whether if you are dealing with some kind of agriculture, or if you're dealing with raising either plants or animals, then naturally the new year is going to begin in the springtime. And certainly we see this represented in the Torah. The agricultural season begins for the Torah in the springtime. It begins basically, essentially, at the beginning of the first month, or at Hag HaMazoth, and essentially lasts until 6 months later on the 15th day of the 7th month, which is Hag Sukkot, or actually at the end of Hag Sukkot, which is 8 days later. Okay, so that's what we see here in the Torah, and that makes perfect sense. The idea of Rosh Hashanah, the new year starting in the fall, makes absolutely no intuitive sense, and it has absolutely no support whatsoever in the Torah. The verses that the rabbis base this idea on, which I will not get into right now, are essentially misinterpreted. And essentially, you can find some verses where it says that the year it says the year goes out. It says Tzeit Shana or Tkufat Shana, speaking about the time of Sukkot. So the rabbis say, oh, that says the year goes out. Tzeit Shana means the going out of the year, but it doesn't mean that. It means the end of the agricultural year. And the agricultural year in Israel and in the Middle East in general lasts essentially 6 months, from the time the earliest crops are ripe, which is the barley crop, until the time that the final fruits, which would be the olives, are picked. That lasts basically 6 months, and after that, then the rains come in. You have the rainy season, and it's not appropriate to start harvesting things. Okay, so the agricultural season essentially lasts 6 months, from the 15th of the first month, in other words, from Passover until Sukkot, more or less. Okay, all right. So let's move on here, and I'm going to skip a bunch of verses because I just want to focus on things that are really relevant to us here. Okay, so I might just gloss over some verses. I'll read them in Hebrew, and we'll see if we want to speak about them or not. So we're now in Exodus chapter 12, verse 3. Okay, and I hope everybody can hear and everybody can see. I think so. Let me just check that everything is set up correctly. It seems to be. Okay, so Dabru el kol adat Yisrael lemor ba'asor lechodesh hazeh yichu lehem ish se leveit avot se lebayit. Okay, so I actually want to skip over this part because this is all speaking about the Passover sacrifice. Okay, and it's important, obviously, but I don't want to focus on this. I want this, as I said, to be more of a Passover Q&A, more of what we do in this day and age, and a bit more about the history of how Passover came to be, or how Hag HaMazoth, the Passover sacrifice, and Hag HaMazoth came to be what it is. It is what it was in ancient times and what it is today. Okay, so let's see here. Let me just skip ahead a little bit. I don't know about Im. I'll just read through in the Hebrew without translating. Okay, let's go to verse 7. V'lakahu min hadam v'natnu al shtei hamizuzot v'al hamashkof al habatim asher yochlu oto bahem. And you could just follow along in the English. Verse 8. Ve'achlu et habasar b'layla hazeh tzli ish matzot al mirorim yochluhu. So here's something important. Okay, so this is talking about that first Passover sacrifice. Okay, so let's keep in mind here what we're talking about. There was a first Passover sacrifice, and then there was a Passover sacrifice each year following it, which is the commemoration of that first Passover sacrifice. So what was the first Passover sacrifice? The Israelites were commanded to take a lamb, actually I think a goat and a lamb, and they were commanded to slaughter it and then take blood from it and then rub that blood on the doorposts and the top part, which is called the lintel, the lintel, not the lentil, but the lintel. Okay, basically rub it all over the door posts of the house. And so when the destroying angel, okay, amashchit, when the destroying angel came through at midnight on the 15th day of the first month, when they saw the blood of this original Passover sacrifices on the doorposts and lintels of the Israelite houses, then the destroying angel would pass over that house, would skip that house, and not destroy the firstborn in that house. Okay, so that's the first Passover sacrifice, and that's what's being spoken about here. Okay, so we see here that first Passover sacrifice, and I'll translate this one, verse 8. Okay, so first of all, what day are we talking about? Wait 1 second here. Let's go back. So you're supposed to hold on to this lamb that you've taken until the 14th day of the first month. Okay, and then it's slaughtered. Okay, and then verse 7 says, min hadam. So take from the blood, and rub it on the two doorposts. The mashkof again is the top part of the doorpost, the lintel. Al habatim asher yochlu oto behem, of the houses in which you are eating this Passover sacrifice. Okay, verse 8. V'achlu et habasar b'layla hazeh. So on that night, or on this night, you shall eat the meat, the flesh, the meat of the sacrifice, tzli esh, roasted in fire, matzot al merorim yochluhu, and you shall eat it with matzot, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs. You shall eat it. Okay, so this is very important because we see that the Israelites, before they even leave the land of Egypt, are commanded to take this Passover sacrifice, this original Passover sacrifice, rub the blood on the doorposts, and then take the flesh of that blood, and on the night of the 14th, basically meaning after the 14th ends, at the beginning of the 15th day of the first month, then to take the meat of this Passover sacrifice and eat it with unleavened bread, with matzah, and with rorim, with bitter herbs. Okay, so that's reason number one. That's reason number one that we don't eat leavened bread to this day and age on Passover, because in that original Passover, when the destroying angel actually passed over the houses of the Israelites, we were commanded to eat unleavened bread with that original Passover sacrifice, unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Okay, now we mentioned another reason, and we're going to get to that other reason, which is with the story of the actual Exodus. When the Israelites exit the land of Egypt, they go out into the desert. They didn't have time. There was no time for the bread to rise. So when they got out into the desert, they ate unleavened bread. And often what we're going to see in the Torah, often what we do see in the Torah, is that there are multiple reasons given for the same commandment or for the same particular issue, okay? Or sometimes there are multiple reasons given for the same name. The example I always like to use is the name Beersheba. Beersheba is a city in the Negev in southern Israel. And if we look back in the book of Genesis, there are two reasons given for the name Beersheba. The first has to do with 7 wells. The word for 7 in Hebrew is Sheva. You can even hear Sheva in the word 7. And the other reason is that an oath was taken over those over the well that was dug there. And the word for oath in biblical Hebrew and in modern Hebrew is Shavua. Okay, so Shavua and Sheva, one means 7, one means oath, and they both sound alike. In fact, they both have the same underlying 3-letter root, even though the roots don't mean the same thing. But they both have the underlying root shin vet ayin, okay, sheva meaning 7, and shavua meaning oath. And 2 different stories are given about that particular well that was dug in Beersheba. And so Beer means well. So it's either the well of 7, because it speaks about seven animals that were given in exchange for the agreement that was made, or Beersheba means the well of the oath. So the well of 7 or the well of the oath, both can both have that sheva, that shin vet ayin root, and so that's where you get the name Beersheba. So 2 different reasons given for the same name Beersheba. And here we're going to see, when we get back to the idea of Hag HaMazoth, when we get back to the idea of the original Passover, and later on the Passover sacrifice that's to be brought each year, followed by the festival of unleavened bread, we're going to see a number of reasons for why this is instituted. So here's our first reason. So reason number 1, that original Passover sacrifice on that year that the Israelites exited from Egypt was to be eaten with unleavened bread, with matzah, with matzot, and with bitter herbs. So that's reason number 1. That's the first place we see here, matzot, unleavened bread. Okay? Any questions, any comments so far about what we're speaking about? Anybody? Now I'll look at the comments for a second. I'm not going to go back. No? Okay. All right. So let's move on. So here are various other mitzvot regarding the Passover sacrifice. Again, I'm really just going to skip over them. I'll just read the Hebrew, but I'm not going to translate. I'm only going to speak about things that are relevant to us. Okay. אל תאכלו ממנו נא, ובשל מבושל במים, כי אם צלי אש ראשו על קרעו ועל קרבו. Okay. So the whole thing is to be roasted. I will say one very quick thing. These things that are to be roasted include the head and the legs. We are now on our Shabbat studies and also the entrails. Okay, we are now in our studies. We are studying the book of Leviticus, and we see that for the sacrifices, usually these parts are what are discarded. Okay, these are thrown onto the pile next to the altar. They're not even thrown on top of the altar. These are considered the waste parts of the sacrifice: the head, the legs, and the entrails. And here they're actually burnt, or they actually roasted on the fire with the entire sacrifice, which is a bit out of the ordinary, and it shows just how important the Passover sacrifice is. Not any of it is discarded. All of it is part of the sacrifice. Anyway, that's a side note. Let's move on. ולא תותירו ממנו עד בוקר, ונותר ממנו עד בוקר באש תשרפו. So anything that's left over to the morning is burnt. In other words, it's destroyed by fire. וככה תאכלו אותו, מותניכם חגורים, נעליכם ברגליכם, ומקלכם בידכם, ואכלתם אותו בחיפזון. פסח הוא ליהוה. This is the Passover sacrifice. Pesach hu Yahweh. This is the Passover sacrifice to Yahweh. Again, whenever you see the word Pesach throughout the entire Tanakh, it does not mean the 7-day holiday that we celebrate, that we're in the middle of celebrating right now. It means the Passover sacrifice. That's what it means. The holiday is called Hag HaMazoth, the festival of unleavened bread. The word Pesach does not refer to that holiday. It refers to the sacrifice. Yes, the holiday is intimately connected to that sacrifice. It follows the bringing of the sacrifice. Okay, that night, or right after you bring the sacrifice, is when the holiday starts. But there are two distinct things, and it's very important to keep that in mind. Pesach means the actual sacrifice. Hag HaMazoth, the festival of unleavened bread, means the 7-day holiday following the Passover sacrifice. Okay, but we shouldn't get the two confused. When the rabbis say that it's called Chag Pesach, it's called the Passover holiday, that is incorrect. It is true that there is one place in the Torah where it's called Chag Pesach, but what that really means is the festival following the Passover sacrifice. But the festival itself is always called Hag HaMazoth, the festival of unleavened bread. All right, let's move on. We're in verse 12 here. ועברתי בארץ מצרים בלילה הזה, והכיתי כל בכור בארץ מצרים, מאדם ועד בהמה, ובכל אלוהי מצרים עשה שבטים, אני יהוה. Okay, so now God says he's going to pass through on that night. He's going to kill all of the firstborn, whether it's human beings or animal firstborn. Verse 13, והיה אדם לכם לאות על הבתים, אשר אתם שם ראיתי את הדם, ופסחתי עליכם, ולא יהיה בכם נרף, למחשיט בחקותי בארץ מצרים. Okay, so when the destroying angel, and the destroying angel here is the mashchit. The word mashchit means to destroy, okay, to obliterate. So the destroying angel is the one that passes through at midnight of the 15th day of the first month, takes a look at the houses. When that destroying angel sees the blood of the Passover sacrifice on the house, the destroying angel skips over that house and does not destroy the firstborn humans and animals that are part of that household. Okay, so far so good. Okay, let's move on. So now we get to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, so now let's just point out from here to here, this is Exodus 12. From here to here, this is all about that original Passover sacrifice. And when I say the original Passover sacrifice, I mean that sacrifice that the Israelites took, slaughtered it, rubbed the blood on the doorposts and on the lintel, and the destroying angel saw the blood and passed over their houses. That original Passover sacrifice that took place in the land of Egypt on the day that the Israelites, after 400 or 430, or that's another question in and of itself, which we won't get into now. After a certain amount of years, the Israelites exited Egypt after being stuck down there for a number of hundred years. Okay. All right. So now in verse 14, we're no longer speaking about that original Passover sacrifice. We're now speaking about its commemoration each year. In other words, what we are supposed to be doing from year to year. Okay. And here we are in verse 14. והיה היום הזה לכם לזיכרון, חגותם אותו חג ליהוה, לדורותיכם חוקת עולם תחגוהו. Okay, so this day shall be for you as a memorial, as a commemoration, okay, and you shall celebrate it as a festival to Yahweh throughout your generations. It is an eternal statute that you should celebrate it. Okay, so what are we talking about? We now know that in commemoration, okay, of this original event. Excuse me for 1 second. I got to go grab some water. Dry throat alert. Be right back. What did I do with my water? Okay, I'm back with my water, my sparkling water. And by the way, this is where is it? Special sparkling water. It's been blessed by me, and it's available on my website. Just use the code 10% off. No, I'm joking. I don't sell sparkling water. That's been blessed by me on my website. Who do you think I am? Nehemiah Gordon? I mean, come on, give me a break. All right. So, at any rate, let's move on. Oh, Harlan, how you doing? That's an old friend of mine. Okay. A very good old friend who we've been in contact over the past couple of days, and it's always a pleasure to be in contact with him. Okay, so right, so let's move on. Okay, okay, so now we're talking about what do we do each year. Okay, and again, it's very important to make a distinction between what happened that first year, the original Passover, and what we're supposed to do each year to commemorate that original Passover, that original Exodus from Egypt. So what do we do? Verse 15. שבעת ימים עשות תאכלו, אך ביום הראשון תשביתו שאור מבתיכם, כי כל אוכל חמץ ונכרתה נפש ההיא מישראל מיום הראשון עד יום השביעי. So what do we do? For 7 days, matzot tochelu. You shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, why are we eating unleavened bread? Well, we've seen a reason that we're eating unleavened bread each year for 7 days. We've seen one reason so far. And what's the reason we saw? We saw that because of that, with that original Passover sacrifice, we were to eat unleavened bread, matzah, with bitter herbs, with mirorim. Where was that? That's in verse 8, right? We said that's reason number one. And we're going to see more reasons because we said the Torah often gives multiple reasons that kind of intersect, okay, that kind of come together to explain why we're doing a certain thing or why something is given a certain name, etc. Okay? So you shall eat the flesh on that night, talking about the original Passover sacrifice on the actual night when the Israelites exited from Egypt. Tzli esh, roasted on fire, matzot al marorin yochluhu, and you shall eat it with unleavened bread, with matzah and bitter herbs. You shall eat it. Okay, so that's reason number one, that we're eating for 7 days each year after that original Exodus. Okay, after the actual Exodus. That's one of the reasons, and again, we're going to see more. That's one of the reasons that we're eating unleavened bread. And so that's what we see here in verse 15. For 7 days, you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay. Okay. So if I were to translate this literally, okay, it would say, and or but on that first day, you shall eliminate. Eliminate, tashbitu, comes from the same root as Shabbat. Shabbat means to make, to halt, or to cease, right? On the Shabbat, we cease work, we halt from doing work. Tashbitu is what's called the hifil, or the causative form of that underlying root Shabbat, and it means to cause, to cease. In other words, to eliminate. You shall eliminate seor mi batechem. Hold on, I've got a drink. Okay, seor mi batechem. So you will eliminate seor from your houses. What is seor? Okay, we'll get to that question in a second, but the first thing I would like to point out is it doesn't mean on the first day of Passover. Okay, ba yom rishon means by the first day of Passover. In other words, by the time that the I shouldn't say Passover, by the time that the festival of unleavened bread starts, you shall have already eliminated all of the seor from your houses. Okay, what is seor? So we said that the three things that are forbidden on Hag HaMazoth, on the festival of unleavened bread, are chametz, seor, and machmetzet. Chametz, we said, is leavened bread. In fact, chametz is the polar opposite of matzah. They're basically just as black is the opposite of white, just as sunset is the opposite of sunrise, just as a boy is the opposite of a girl, unless you live in the United States or Canada. Then I don't know what's the opposite of anything anymore. But in that way, matzah is the opposite of chametz. They are polar opposites, and they are used as polar opposites in the Torah. In other words, they are contrasted to each other. In other words, it will say sometimes not matzah but chametz, or not chametz but matzah. Okay, you have to think of matzah and chametz as polar opposites. How are they polar opposites? One is leavened bread, one is bread with leavening agent, one is bread without leavening agent. Okay, they're both bread, they're both lechem. Okay, lechem is the Hebrew word for bread, but one doesn't have leavening agent, that's matzah. One does have a leavening agent, that's chametz. Okay, so where does seor come into the picture? Well, as we said at the beginning of the talk, seor, which is usually translated, let's see how they translate it here, leaven. Okay, that's good enough translation. Seor is what we call concentrated leavening agent. And again, the way to remember the word seor, what it really means, is that the English word sour is and can be shown to be related etymologically to the biblical Hebrew word seor. So seor is sourdough starter. For anyone who's ever made sourdough bread, you know exactly what that is. Okay, it's the sourdough starter is the concentration of yeast, and it's not only yeast, actually, it's yeast and bacteria that cause dough to rise, that basically consume the sugars in the dough, and they spit out, or maybe fart out would be a better way to say it. They release carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide gets caught between the molecules of the bread, specifically between the gluten. Okay, gluten is the protein in wheat and other related grains, and the reason it's called gluten is because it's related to the word glue. It glues all of the dough together. Okay, so that means that when these little yeasts and these little bacteria spit out, we'll call it spit, fart out their carbon dioxide, those little molecules of carbon dioxide, they don't escape out of the bread. They get caught by the gluten, and that's why they form these little air bubbles, and that's exactly how the dough rises. If you take a substance that doesn't have gluten or something similar, that isn't able to trap the carbon dioxide molecules, then they'll just escape, and you will not be able to rise such a dough. So what would be a classic example? If you take corn meaning maize, corn like corn on the cob kind of thing. If you take corn flour, it doesn't matter how thin you grind it, okay, and you add yeast or you add concentrated leavening agent and you add water and you basically try to do the same process that you would with wheat or spelt or rye or any of the other grains from the wheatgrass family, then it will not rise, because when it is true that the yeast and the bacteria, they will spit out. I'm going to use the word fart because I think it really explains it correctly. They will fart out their carbon dioxide, but it'll escape right out of the dough because there's no gluten that holds it in. It's not able to form air bubbles within the dough, because the protein that's found in the wheatgrass family, the gluten, which holds the bubbles in, is not present in maize/corn, and it'll just escape right out of the dough, and the dough will not rise. Or if it rises, it will rise very minimally. Okay, so that's important to know. Okay, it's important to keep in mind what's going on when we make bread, and therefore this explains exactly what this or is. So or is sourdough starter. Okay, it's concentrated leavening agent. If you make sourdough bread, then you know what sourdough starter is. If you're not familiar with the process of making sourdough, then the best way to explain it to you is if you were to go to the grocery store and buy yeast, right, concentrated yeast, then that essentially serves the same purpose. Okay, how do you make bread in this day and age if you're not making sourdough? If you want to make your own homemade bread, you take some flour, you add some water to it, okay, and then you add some yeast to it. That's the most simple way. It's actually a bit more complex than that. You add some yeast to it, you mix it all together, and the yeast starts eating away at the sugars in the flour, and then farts out the carbon dioxide, and boom, the bread starts rising. Okay, so what you need in order to make bread rise is concentrated leavening agent, yeast, and in our day and age, there are other common substances that are used as concentrated leavening agents. The two most common, aside from the yeast you would buy in the store, and aside from sourdough starter, if you make your own sourdough bread, would be baking powder and baking soda. Okay, so those are the four main ones. Actually, the three main ones that you'll find in most products in this day and age are either yeast, baking powder, or baking soda. All three will cause dough to rise in different ways. Okay, all right, let's move on. So this concentrated leavening agent, I'm going to call it, okay, this concentrated yeast has to be removed from your house by the time that Hag HaMazoth, by the time the festival of unleavened bread begins. So this is the other thing that we're forbidden to have around us during Hag HaMazoth, okay? And we'll talk about it more in detail afterwards, but I think we understand what it is and the fact that it's not supposed to be sitting around once Hag HaMazoth starts. And why is it not supposed to be sitting around once Hag HaMazoth starts? Because it's the only purpose it had, especially in ancient times, was to make bread, okay? And since we're not allowed to have bread for the 7 days, okay, we shall eat matzot for 7 days, then we also shouldn't have this sourdough starter, so that maybe there's no temptation to make any bread, or maybe there's nothing that even has anything to do with bread making, with rising bread or with making risen bread anywhere in our sites. We're supposed to eliminate anything associated with making leavened bread, with making chametz during these 7 days, okay? I'll talk about this a little bit more afterwards, but let's move on now, okay? And then we see kol ochel chametz v'nichrata nefesh meYisrael, because anyone who eats leavened bread, chametz, that person shall be cut off, or that person will go with, shall be cut off from Israel, okay? Miyom rishon ad yom shvi'i, and this rule applies from the first day until the 7th day of Hag HaMazoth. Okay, so from the first day to the 7th day of this festival, Hag HaMazoth, then no chametz is to be eaten, and all leavening agent is to be removed from the house by the time the festival starts. Okay, any questions? Any comments so far? Anybody? You guys are all good? Makes sense? Everything clear so far? Oh, I should hide that. Okay, goodbye. Okay, cool. All right, let's move on. We are now in Exodus chapter 12, verse 16. ביום הראשון מקרא קודש וביום השביעי מקרא קודש יהיה לכם כל מלאכה לא יעשה בהם. Okay, so let's go up to here. Okay, boom. So on the first day is a holy convocation. That basically means a holiday. And on the seventh day is a holy convocation. Kol melacha lo ya'aseh bahem. No work. And melacha is a whole story in and of itself, but I'm just going to translate it as work, or no unnecessary work or unnecessary tasks are to be done on those days. Okay. Ach asher ye'achel lechol nefesh hu levado ye'aseh lechem. Except that which is, it literally says ach asher ye'achel lechol nefesh, that which is to be eaten for each person. In other words, what this implies is any work or any tasks that are required for food preparation are allowed to be done on the first day and the seventh day of Hag HaMazoth. This is in contrast to the Shabbat, which is a complete cessation of work, and you're not even allowed to do any work related to food preparation, right? Everything is to be done as much as possible before the Shabbat comes in. This is a bit more lenient. It's not a Shabbat, okay? So you are supposed to refrain from any unnecessary work. You can't fix the pipes. You can't paint the fence. Okay, you can't sit down and figure out your taxes. You can't say, oh, my client wants me to do a couple of hours of work. Can't do any of that stuff. But the one thing you are allowed to do on the first and seventh day of Hag HaMazoth is anything regarding food preparation. So that heter, that dispensation is given. This is again opposed to Shabbat, when you're not even allowed to do this, and also on Yom Kippurim, which is also called a Shabbat, when you're not allowed to do any food preparation at all, which of course is logical because on Yom Kippurim we're fasting anyway. No food is to be eaten. Okay, but on Hag HaMazoth, and I think by extension on the other holidays which are not Yom Kippurim, then then milacha is not supposed to be done, except food preparation. Milacha, work associated with food preparation, is allowed. Okay, so to put that in terms of what's important for this day and age. So that means that today, which is the first day of Hag HaMazoth, according to the biblical calendar, you are allowed to cook an egg. You're allowed to make some macaroni. You're allowed to cook a fish out on the grill, whatever you want. That you're allowed to do, but don't start painting the fence. Don't fix the neighbor's plumbing. Don't get a little bit of work done from work that you took home, etc. Okay, I think it's pretty clear. Okay, talking about what you are allowed to eat and what you're not allowed to eat on Hag HaMazoth, we will get to that. But one thing that I will point out right now, since we mentioned it, is, and this usually comes as a surprise to people, is you are allowed to eat pasta. You can go to the store, you can buy a box of macaroni, you can make your own macaroni. That is not leavened bread. Okay, and I always say, and I've said for years and years, one of the best ways to know what you're allowed to eat on Passover, and I'm calling it Passover colloquially, what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to eat on Hag HaMazoth, on the festival of unleavened bread, is to know your food, know how food is made, know how food is prepared, read the ingredients. You should be doing this anyway, because most food that you buy in the store is filled with such junk that you should always be reading the ingredients. That's my life advice. Okay, I'm very into natural foods. I eat mostly unprocessed foods. I always check the ingredients, whether it's Passover or not Passover. I always check the ingredients before I buy food anywhere. Okay, and if you do this over time, you'll really get an idea of what goes into your food, and you'll get an idea of what these various ingredients mean. So let's talk about pasta for a second, since that's usually the most common and the most shocking. There's absolutely nothing in regular pasta. In other words, if you just go to the store and buy a bag of macaroni or even a bag of egg noodles, there's absolutely nothing in that pasta which would constitute leavened bread. Okay, how is pasta made? Well, go to the store, look at the ingredients on a bag of pasta, and usually you'll see just one ingredient and one ingredient only. It usually says either wheat or durum wheat. Durum wheat just means hard wheat, and that's just a certain varietal of wheat. The harder wheat makes for a better pasta noodle. Okay, sometimes it'll say durum wheat and water, and sometimes if it's egg noodles, it'll say wheat, eggs, or it'll say flour. I'm sorry, it won't say wheat. It'll say wheat flour, eggs, or wheat flour, eggs, and water. Okay, in pasta, those are generally, unless you're getting some very strange pasta, those are generally the only ingredients. In fact, in standard pasta, if it's not egg noodles, All it is just flour, wheat flour, and water. Okay, no leavening agent. If it's not a leavening agent in a food, then it is not leavened bread. I don't care if you let it sit from today until next year. It will not rise. There will not be, if it doesn't have concentrated leavening agent, that dough will not rise. It might rise a tiny, tiny, tiny little drop, but not enough to constitute leavened bread for sure. Okay, in order to make leavened bread, you need, what do we see in the previous verse? You need this, or you need concentrated leavening agent. You need either sourdough or yeast or baking powder or baking soda or any of the other less common leavening agents that we'll see in this day and age. Okay, and afterwards I'll talk about those various leavening agents. But for now, those are the four main ones. Sourdough starter, and that's not even so common in this day and age. It's basically yeast, baking powder, baking soda. If the food you're buying does not have one of those three things, then 99.9% chance it is not chametz. Okay, and pasta does not have it. If you've ever made pasta at home, homemade pasta, which is really easy to do, you basically take flour, you add water to it. If you're Italian, you add eggs to it. But if you're not Italian, you don't even have to add eggs to it. I'm not Italian. So you take water, you take flour, you form it into a dough. You knead it a lot, then you roll it out really thin. You cut it, or you put it through a pasta machine, and then you can either cook it right away or you can let it dry. Either way, it's not going to rise. It does not have leavening agent. So you can go make macaroni and cheese. Cheese, the Egyptian Karaites, the traditional Egyptian Karaites would also say is forbidden on Passover because it is a fermented food. And we're going to get to fermented foods in a while. That, in my strong opinion, is ridiculous. Fermented foods are completely permitted on Passover because Passover has absolutely nothing to do with fermented foods. It has to do with unleavened bread versus leavened bread. It has to do with matzah versus chametz. Chametz is forbidden. Matzah is permitted. Okay? Okay, let's move on. Any questions, any comments so far? If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, if not, let's move on. So anyone who eats chametz, anyone who eats leavened bread is cut off from Israel. Okay, that's Karaite. We won't get into exactly what that means, but we know it's a pretty bad thing. Okay, you're basically excised from the community. You're expelled from the community. Okay, verse 16. Oh, we read this already. Okay, so first and seventh day are Hagim, are actual, I shouldn't say Hagim, are Mikra'e Kodesh, are holy convocations, and no work is to be done on them except that which is required for food preparation. Okay, let's move on to verse 17. V'shamatem et hamatzot. So you should keep matzot. What does that mean? You shall keep the matzot. This is really shorthand for Hag HaMazoth. This is the name of the holiday, Hag HaMazoth. So you shall keep the, in parentheses, festival of unleavened bread. Okay, so you shall keep the festival of unleavened bread. Keep etzem. Hayom hazeh otzeti et tzivotechem me'eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, because on this very day, meaning on the day that the festival of unleavened bread begins. When does the festival of unleavened bread begin? It begins on the 15th of the first month. On this very day this very day, the 15th of the first month, this is the day that Yahweh, after X hundred years, took us out of Egypt and freed us from the house of slavery, the house of the slave pit of Egypt. Okay, so because on this very day, I caused your hosts, your armies, to exit from the land of Egypt. And just think about what a big thing it is, okay? Think about being stuck in, let's say, the United States of America, right? And we see the situation deteriorating in the United States of America for Jews. Okay, we've been there for what? As Jews, we've been there for 100 years, 150 years. My ancestors came to the United States mostly in the early 1900s. Like in the 1910s and the early 1920s. So our family, I'm not there right now, but our family has been there, let's say, for 100 years. Okay. And finally, maybe God is going to come free all of us from the bondage of that sick, distorted country known as the United States of America. And it's gonna feel really good after being stuck there in the slave pits of America and materialism and Christianity. It's going to feel really good to get the heck out of there if we all don't get killed on the way, because things are really deteriorating for the Jews in the United States of America. I just read an article this morning, actually, speaking about, who was it? I think it was Senator Hawley or something like that. I think it was Josh Hawley is now saying that either the National Guard or the Army, the American Army, should be called in to protect Jews on college campuses, because there is so much violence, threatened violence, and actual violence being committed against Jews throughout the United States, especially in the northeastern United States. This particular senator, who's a really good guy, is actually calling on the Army, the American Army, to protect Jews on campus. Well, if it gets to that point, we know things have really turned the corner, right? This has never ever been the case before, at least not in my lifetime, in the United States of America. Okay, at any rate, Shematim et hayom hazeh ledoratechem chukat olam. Okay, and you'll keep this day throughout your generations. It is an eternal statute. Okay, so you shall keep this day. Really, it's 7 days, but why does it say this day? Either this day really means these days, okay, or another way to look at it is it means this day, which the beginning of which, since the holiday begins on the 15th of the first month, that it's speaking about the holiday that begins on that particular day. And I think actually that's the preferred understanding, because it speaks about on this very day is when I took you out of the land of Egypt, and we were taken out of the land of Egypt on the 15th day of the first month. So you shall keep this day, okay, meaning the 15th of the first month, or the holiday that begins on this very day on the 15th of the first month, meaning the festival of unleavened bread, which lasts for 7 days but begins on the 15th day of the first month. Verse 18. בראשון ב-14 יום לחודש בערב תאכלו מצות עד יום אחד ו20 לחודש בערב. Okay, so, and this is just clarifying the specific dates of the festival of unleavened bread. So it says barishon, in the first, meaning in the first month, ba'arba asar yom lechodesh, on the 14th day of the month. Okay, ba'erev, in the evening, and I'll explain what this means in a second. Tochlu matzot, you shall begin eating matzot. You shall eat matzot ad yom echad ve'esrim lachodesh ba'erev, until the 21st day of the month in the evening. Okay, so this is important, and it's a verse that could be misunderstood if it's not if it's taken without an understanding of the way time in biblical Hebrew works, so specifically the beginning and end of days. So this is really what it means. Okay, so in the first month, on the 14th day in the evening, this means after sunset on the 14th day. Okay, what we have in the Torah is this word erev. Sometimes it's ben arba'im. The elongated version or the more extended version is ben arba'im, which is usually translated between the sunsets or between the evenings. For short, it's usually just erev, and erev comes from the underlying root ayin resh vet, which means mixing. So it's, if we were to translate it, if we were to give a better translation, instead of calling it evening, we might translate it as the mixing time. What does that mean, the mixing time? The mixing between day and night. It's not quite day and it's not quite night. And we know what that means just from common experience. After the sun sets, it's not immediately dark outside. It takes about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depends on where you live. The farther away you are from the equator, then the longer it takes before the influence of the sun, the influence of the sun's light, or I should say the influence of the sun's direct light is no longer present on the earth in the sky. Okay, the sun's presence is no longer visible. Okay, so when does day end? According to the Torah, the day ends the moment the sun sets. In other words, the moment we can no longer see the disk of the sun. The disk of the sun disappears below the western horizon. That is the end of what's called day. Okay, and then begins the period of erev, the mixing time. Okay, it's a mix between day and night, and this continues until the sun continues to go below the western horizon, until about an hour later, until that the light of the sun is no longer has any influence on the earth or in the sky that we can see. In other words, what's called total darkness, okay, or maximal darkness. It's not total darkness because there's always light. We have light from the stars. We have light from the moon. We have light from, if we're living in a city, we have light from the city lights. Right? The sky never becomes completely dark. Okay, there's always something there, even if there's cloud cover. then we're going to have light reflecting. The city lights are going to reflect off the clouds and back onto the earth. So it's never total darkness, but what I like to call maximal darkness, the time when the moment when, or the point at which the sky reaches the level of darkness that is maximum for the night for that particular night. And that depends on the phase of the moon. If it's a full moon, it's going to be less dark. If it's a new moon, meaning an astronomical new moon where the moon is not visible at all, then it's going to be more dark. Okay, if it's cloudy, it's going to be more dark. If it's a clear night, then you're going to be able to see the stars. Even if you can't see the moon, the stars will provide a little bit of light. You get the idea. Okay, so this mixing time, this mixing time is the time between sunset and maximum darkness, a period of about an hour. Okay, as we say in English, the evening. We all know what the evening is. Okay, it's neither day or it's neither night. Better translation, once again, would be the mixing time. Okay, so what do we see here? So this means on the 14th day of the month in the evening. What does this mean? This means after the sun sets on the 14th day. Okay. Now, the way we number the days in the biblical calendar, in the Torah, is they start in the evening. Okay. So some people will say they start at, or a lot of people say they start at sunset, that the next day starts at sunset. That's not really clear. That's not really 100% true. If you look at the Torah, you see that, again, this mixing period, this evening is kind of an intermediate period. It's not quite the 14th, and it's not quite the 15th. And sometimes the Torah will refer to it as the following day, in this example, the 15th, and sometimes it will refer to it as still being part of the previous day, the 14th. And that's what's happening here. It means after sun sets on the 14th, meaning the mixing period between the 14th and the 15th, or the 14th transforming into the 15th. And as soon as there's total darkness, then it's no longer, for sure, no longer the 14th. It is now the 15th. But this is kind of an intermediate period. Okay. So after the sun sets on the 14th day, meaning right about when the 15th day is beginning of the first month, okay, that's when you begin to eat unleavened bread. And this continues until the sun sets on the 21st day. Okay. So basically, when the sun sets on the 14th, that means it's more or less the beginning of the 15th, aside from the mixing period, which can be either the 14th or the 15th, depending on how the Torah wants to express it. So when do we eat unleavened bread? The 15th. Okay, after sunset on the 14th, the beginning of the 15th. We eat on the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st. That's 7 days. When the sun sets on the 21st day, okay, or more exactly, when total darkness is reached after the sunset on the 21st day, that's when we can once again eat leavened bread. Okay? All right. Any questions, any comments? All right, let's move on. So, verse 19. Okay, let's go up to there. So, for 7 days, sourdough starter, leavening agent, yeast, okay, concentrating leavening agent is not to be found in your houses. Okay, let's talk about this now for a second. So let's break this verse into two versets. I like to call them verselets. So for 7 days, yeast or concentrating leavening agent is not to be found in your houses. Okay, so we saw this above. Okay, that we're supposed to get rid of concentrating leavening agent, of sourdough starter, by the time Hag HaMazoth starts. In other words, by sunset at the end of the 14th day of the first month. Okay, and it says should not be found in your houses. So this means, does this mean you have to destroy it, or does this mean that you have to hide it? I don't know. You can go either way on this, and I usually like to say it this way: it's better to destroy it. But if you just can't destroy it, because let's say some starter dough, for those again who make sourdough bread, so the sourdough starter, it can be passed down from bread to bread, and sometimes it's actually passed down for generations. Okay, it's obviously not exactly the same starter dough, but it's kind of a continuation. Anyone who makes sourdough bread knows what I mean, because you're taking from each new batch of bread or new batch of dough, you're taking a little pinch off of it, and you're using that as the sourdough starter for the next batch of bread. So it's kind of like becomes family tradition. Oh, this sourdough starter I started it 10 years ago, or I started 20 years ago, or my grandmother started it, and it's that same continuing chain of sourdough starters that goes back to my grandmother or my great grandmother. Okay, so I think just naturally speaking, this would imply that maybe it just is not to be seen. Okay, lo yimatse, it should not be found in your houses. Okay, it could mean either it shouldn't be there at all, it should be destroyed. It should mean maybe take it out of your house, put it in the garage. It should mean maybe just hide it in the basement, or if you don't have a basement, then just put it away somewhere where it's not visible. I think it's ambiguous. Better safe than sorry. If you can, then destroy all of your leavening agents. Just throw them in the garbage or burn them or whatever you need to do. Any yeast you have sitting around the house, any sourdough starter you have sitting around the house, any baking powder you have sitting around the house, any baking soda you have sitting around the house, just burn it, throw in the garbage, throw in the dumpster outside, whatever you need to do, get rid of it completely. That would be obviously the clearest way or the most safe way to keep this commandment. But I think the fact that this verse uses yimatzeh, should be found or should not be found, lo yimatzeh, would imply that if you don't want to do that, then just remove it from your house, put it in the garage, or hide it in the basement, or just hide it away. Okay? Do you have to sell it to a goy, as the rabbis do? That's ridiculous. Okay? In fact, I think that's an insult to this mitzvah because it's just playing legalistic, games with the commandment. Okay? So practically speaking, the way I interpret this verse, and again, as Karaites, we don't rely on our chachamim, on our quote unquote rabbis, to give the law, and that's the end of it. It's a suggestion. It's my understanding. What I think this means is that if it's best to destroy it completely, but if for whatever reason you can't, then just hide it somewhere, and you certainly don't have to go around and sign some ridiculous legalistic piece of paper which says you should sell it to a goy. We don't. In the Torah, we're not doing, we're not playing legalistic games. Okay, we're not jumping through hoops to make us, look good. Okay, I have baking soda for health reasons. I will hide it. Okay, cool. If it's for health reasons, I would say that if you need it, as long as you don't use it to make bread, to make leavened dough, then I would say if you really need it, you can even keep it if it really is for health reasons. Okay. All right. So that's that. But we are to remove, where do we see it? In verse, where was it? In verse 13, Tashpitus orbi batechem. Okay. Cause all sourdough starter, cause all leavening agents to be removed from your house by the time the first day of Hag HaMazoth rolls around. By the time Hag HaMazoth begins, basically meaning by sunset on the end of the 14th day of the first month. Okay? All right, so let's go back here. Okay, so Kikol ochel machmetzet v'nichrata nefesh ahi me'adat Yisrael bager u be'ezrach ha'aretz. Because anyone who eats machmetzet, and we're going to talk about this a lot, v'nichrata nefesh ahi, that person is cut off from the community, or literally the witnessing community, the witnesses of Israel, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the real Jehovah's Witnesses, whether it's a convert, quote unquote, or a native-born Israelite someone who's native-born. Basically, I'll just translate it as a native-born Israelite. Literally says a native-born of the land. Okay. Okay. So we saw above. Let's find it here. We saw above the threat of being cut off, of Karaite. What did we see? Okay, let's look and compare these two verses. Okay, we're now going back to verse 15. B'yom rishon tashpitu seor mebatechem ki kol ochel chametz v'nichrata hanefesh ahi meYisrael. Okay, this is verse 15. But by the first day, you shall eliminate all leavening agents from your houses, because anyone who eats leavened bread, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Okay, so eliminate leavening agents, because anyone who eats leavened bread shall be cut off from Israel. Let's compare that now to this verse here that we just read. Okay, second. Can I do it this way? No, I can't. I can't like do. Okay. Let's do this. I'm going to do this. 1 second here. I can color it in to make the point. Get this out of the way. 1 second. Oh, darn. Okay. I can color it in like this. Okay, so we're looking at this. Ach biyom rishon tashbitus or mebatechem ki kol ochel chametz v'nichrata hanefesh hahi me Yisrael. And we want to compare this to this verse. Shivat yamims or lo yimatzeh bebatechem ki kol ochel machmetzet v'nichrata hanefesh hahi me adat Yisrael. Okay, so we're comparing. Let's move this out of the way. So we're comparing verse 15 with verse 19. Notice they basically both say the same thing. They don't basically, they say exactly the same thing. Let's translate verse 15 again. Ach b'yom rishon tashbitus or mebatechem. But by the first day of what? The first day of Hag HaMazoth, meaning by the time the sun sets at the end of the 14th day of the first month, you shall eliminate concentrated leavening agent from your houses, because anyone who eats leavened bread, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Now, verse 19, 7 days, concentrating leavening agent should not be found in your houses, because anyone who eats machmetzet, we're going to put a question mark there for a second, because anyone who eats machmetzet, that person shall be cut off from the community of Israel. We see that these two verses are saying exactly the same thing. They're repetitions of each other, right? They're the same commandment, essentially exactly, in slightly different words. Okay? Why is this so important? This is extremely important because the rabbinical Jews, because the Egyptian Karaites say that this word here, this word machmetzet, let me underline it or circle it in. They say that this word machmetzet is different from this word chametz. And I want to show you guys that that is ridiculous. It's insanity. Okay? It doesn't make any sense. We see exactly the same commandment. Why is the same commandment mentioned twice? So why is the same commandment mentioned twice and they're so close to each other? Because it's such an important commandment. Okay? It's an extremely important commandment, just like the Shabbat is mentioned many times throughout the Torah. This is an extremely important commandment. Okay. However, what do the traditional Karaites, the quote unquote Egyptian Karaites, say? They say that the word chametz means leavened bread, but they say that the word machmetzet means any fermented foods. And so therefore, they forbid things like wine, vinegar, cheese, sauerkraut. As I mentioned earlier, someone this year told me they're not using mayonnaise, or someone said they're not going to use mayonnaise because mayonnaise contains vinegar. Well, ketchup also contains vinegar, by the way. Anything that's fermented. Kimchi is fermented. In fact, a zillion and one things, some of which you probably don't even think about, are fermented. So let's see, what else is fermented? If I think about it here, we said vinegar, we said wine, we said cheese. Yogurt is fermented. Kefir is fermented. Kimchi is fermented. Sauerkraut is fermented. I don't even know. Just think about various fermented foods, and you'll see that there are a lot of fermented foods, but those are some of the main ones that I mentioned right now. Okay. And the Egyptian Karaites incorrectly will eliminate that from their diets for the 7 days of Hag HaMazoth. Okay. It doesn't make any sense. What the heck does Hag HaMazoth have to do with sauerkraut? Or what does it have to do with yogurt? It has nothing to do with sauerkraut and yogurt. It has to do with leavened bread. Leavened bread is the thing that we're told again and again that we're not supposed to eat on Hag HaMazoth. We even see an almost exact replication of the commandment here in verse 15 and the commandment here in verse 19. Essentially, the only difference, chametz is replaced with the word machmetzet. Okay, so the Egyptian Karaites are making a big mistake. Not in my opinion, it's a fact. The Egyptian Karaites are making a big mistake because they're saying the word machmetzet is different from the word chametz. Chametz means unleavened bread, whereas machmetzet means anything that's fermented. And so once again, they'll avoid all fermented foods: cheese, wine, vinegar, sauerkraut, yogurt, etc. Okay. So the first thing to point out is, as I said, fermented foods have absolutely nothing to do with the Passover narrative. Okay, we were given one reason so far, which we saw earlier, why we're supposed to eat. I don't think I can go up. Yes, I can. Why we're supposed to eat unleavened bread, and we saw it because that original Passover sacrifice was eaten with matzah and maror. Okay, matzot mirorim. It was eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Okay, so what does it have to do? So what is the context of this 7-day holiday? It's unleavened bread. The original Passover sacrifice was eaten with unleavened bread. It wasn't eaten with sauerkraut. We're not commemorating the Israelites eating lamb with sauerkraut or lamb with yogurt. Okay, it wasn't a gyro, okay, or a gyros or whatever they call it. We used to call it gyro back in New York. Okay, it was eaten with unleavened bread, with matzah, and it was eaten with mirorim, with bitter herbs. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that machmetzet. That if we understand machmetzet as fermented foods, it doesn't make any sense in the narrative of the story. In fact, it's an embarrassment. It's a busha to the story, because the story has to do with unleavened bread. Unleavened bread was eaten with that original Passover Seder, with that original Passover sacrifice. And as we shall see soon, unleavened bread was also eaten by the Israelites when they went out into the desert, because there was no time for the bread to leaven. Okay, so that's the first thing. But there's a second thing as well, and that's a grammatical understanding of this word machmetzet. Okay? And the grammatical understanding of this word machmetzet is very simple. The word machmetzet means exactly the same thing as chametz. And I want to bring a proof. Hold on, I just have to find it. Give me 1 second here. I should have written down chapter and verse, but it's okay. Let me just find it for 1 second. Just bear with me, please. Sorry for the interruption. Here. I'm going to go here. I go to search. I say machmetzet. Just looking for an old Facebook post. There it is. Okay, so we want to go to Leviticus 13, verses 2 and 6. Let me bring that up here. Okay. So we're going to Leviticus 13. Okay, so Leviticus 13 is speaking about what we usually call leprosy, tzara'at. Okay, it's a bad translation, but we'll just go with it for a second. Okay, a better translation is often scale disease, but it's that thing that is known in Hebrew as tzara'at, some kind of affliction that comes or that is associated with somehow maybe divine punishment, or that it essentially makes a person ritually impure. A person has to be cleansed of it. And this is exactly what Leviticus 13 is speaking about. So we're going to go now to Leviticus 13, verse 2. Okay, or actually start it in verse 2. Okay. And let's look at that. Let me just make sure it's visible on the screen. And yes, it is. So Adam ki ye'eb or besaro. So any person upon whose skin, the skin of his flesh is, and now we have a list of afflictions, of ailments or skin diseases. Sa'et or sapachat or baheret. Okay, so sa'et is usually translated as scaled. Wait a second. Let's get a Robert Alter. Let's get an Everett Fox translation for this. Torah. I'm sick of always relying on Robert Alter. People think I worship at the footstool of Robert Alter, which is not true. I think he's very good, but as I've mentioned many times, I find his translation and commentary very accessible, and that's why I use it, but it's not the be-all and the end-all. Okay, so let's look here. So we're in Leviticus, where are we? Leviticus 13. Okay. 13.2. So any human being, when there is on the skin of his body, and this is how Everett Fox, also an excellent translation, a swelling or a scab or a shiny spot. Okay, so that's what we have here. Eight is a swelling, meaning why is it a swelling? It comes from the word word laset, okay, or nasa, a rising up, okay, and so that therefore it's translated here as swelling. And then we have a sapachat, okay. Sapachat is translated by Everett Fox as a scab, okay, and then we have baheret. Bahir we know is bright, so he translates it as a shiny spot. But we're going to focus on the second one, and that's sapachat, okay. So anyone or any person, any human being who has on the skin of his flesh, skin of his body, a swelling or a scab or a shiny spot, okay? And then we go on, okay, I'll just read to the end of the verse. Therefore, that means that on the skin of his flesh is the affliction of sara'at, is the affliction of what is generally translated as leprosy. It's a poor translation, but we'll just go with it for now, okay? Is the affliction of, I won't even translate it, is the affliction of sara'at, okay? Okay, so why is this important? We see here these three symptoms, okay? Again, a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, okay? If a person has any of these three things, then he has sara'at, he has quote unquote leprosy. Let's now go to verse 6 and translate this. So the person is to take a look at him, bayom hashvi'i. So now the Kohen is going to try to purify him, to cleanse him of this leprosy, quote unquote leprosy. And so the Kohen goes to him on, or at least determine if he's been cleansed of leprosy. So the Kohen goes to him, takes a look at him on the seventh day for a second time. And I won't go to the intervening verses because it's not relevant here. V'hine keha hanera velo pasha hanega ba'or v'taharo hakohen. Stop there. Actually, we'll stop here. And if the affliction has faded and velo pasha hanega, and it is not spread further on his skin, v'tiharo hakohen, then the Kohen shall declare him as ritually pure. I have to plug in a second. Let me just try to finish this first. Shall declare him as pure, declare him as cured, okay, from, okay, a Kohen mi sifchat hi v'chibes bigadav v'taher, okay. One second. Mispachat. One second, please. Okay, right. Mispachati v'chibetz begadav v'taher. Okay, it was only a scab. Okay, and the person should wash his clothes, and then he is once again in a state of ritual purity. Okay, the point being here that the Kohen takes a look at it, and if it hasn't spread out, then it turns out that it was only a mispachat. Okay, what do we have here? We have here the word sapachat, and we have here the word mispachat. Okay. But they're essentially the same thing. Here it's a scab, sapachat, and here it's a scab, mispachat. Okay? And what does this say? This tells us that if you place a mem, as we see here before the word sapachat, it doesn't change the essence of its meaning. Yes, this is a symptom that might have been part of a disease, and here it's being said that no, the disease is gone, okay? Or that it never really was a disease in the first place. It was just a scab. But nonetheless, the word sapachat is the same here as the word mispachat. They both mean exactly the same thing. They both mean a scab, or at least as translated by Everett Fox. Okay? Why is this important? This illuminates what we see here back in Exodus 12, that we have here chametz, and here we have machmetzet. It's the same thing, essentially. Okay? Here we have a mem placed before chametz. Yes, it's a tough added at the end, but that really doesn't matter because tough, again, is one of these letters that can kind of drop in and drop out. But the fact that we place a mem before at the beginning of machmetzet, we see based on Leviticus 13 that it doesn't change the meaning. And let me bring it up here as well. Actually, I have to plug in. So just give me 1 second. Let me plug in, and then we will continue. And I'll just continue to emphasize this point. Okay. No, it's not a from prefix. Incorrect. In this case, it's not. Okay. And I'll read it again. Okay. V'lo pasha negab or v'tiro kohen mispachat hi. It's not from a sapachat. It's a mispachat. It is a noun. Okay. And the noun is the same here, a scab, as it is here. Here it's sapachat, and here it's mispachat. Okay. So actually, there's a comma after the word kohen. Okay. The Kohen declares him clear, comma. It was only a scab, and then he washes his clothes, and he is declared clean. Okay. So it's not the prefix. The prefix mem here is not acting as the word from. And if you look at the various translations, you'll see that none of them will translate that as being from a scab. Okay, the Kohen declares him clear. It was only a scab. That's the way to translate this. Okay, let me plug in, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So Itan Avior says the mem is the from prefix. And no, that is not the case. And let's even take a look at a couple of other translations to confirm this. All right, let's look at Robert Alter. And then we'll circle back and we'll explain why this is so important. So this is Leviticus 13. Okay, so verse 6 is what we want to look at. So Robert Alter is translating it not as a scab, but as a rash. Hold on a second. Grab the cat. Go ahead. Okay, sorry about that. I'm back. So let's look at Robert Alter's translation of verse 6. Okay. And the priest shall see him again on the seventh day. And look, if the affliction has faded, if the affliction is not spread on the skin, the priest shall declare him clean. Okay. It is a rash. Okay. No, it is from a rash, or shall declare him clean from a rash. Nothing like that. Okay. It is a rash. And again, in the Hebrew there, that is mispachat hi. It's its own standalone phrase. Okay. It is a rash. So the point being, and if we look at the other translations, it'll be exactly the same thing. Okay. Or similar. So the point being that we have for the same affliction, here it's called sapachat, and here it's called mispachat. Okay, but it means exactly the same thing, and all the translations will confirm this. Okay, so why is it here called the sapachat, and why is it here called mispachat? Well, the reason is that the way that the Torah is written often or sometimes is that words can slightly change in order so that the flow, because remember, the Torah was never meant to be just read in a book. It was meant to be recited orally, right? There were no books in everyone's house. There was no internet. You basically went to a public reading, or you went to a place where there was one of the few copies of the Torah in, let's say, throughout all the land of Israel, which may have been in the Levitical cities or in the gates of particular important cities, and certainly in the temple and in the tabernacle and with the king. But basically, you heard the Torah as it was being read aloud. Okay, and so sometimes the words will slightly change. In other words, letters will drop in and out if they're not significant, or if they don't have any significance in changing the meaning of the word. And that's what we see here. Okay, so seit o safachat, it flows much better than o mispachat. Okay, the o safachat flows, the o flows right into the safachat. And here, because it's a standalone, okay, the mem is added at the beginning. Okay, vitiro kohen, semicolon, mispachati. Okay, so that, and the mem doesn't change the meaning. The mem just changes shall we say, the way that the verse flows. But they both mean exactly the same thing. Okay. Now we go back to Exodus 12, and it's precisely the same thing here. Okay. So here we have chametz, here we have machmetzet, okay? But they both mean exactly the same thing. The mem at the beginning of the machmetzet does not change the meaning from chametz, from leavened bread, to something else, such as the Egyptian Karaites claim that it changes it to meaning any fermented foods, okay? And the tuf at the end, the tuf is certainly one of the letters that drops in and out, okay? And it doesn't change the meaning, okay? So these are basically just two different ways of writing the same word, chametz, and it just means unleavened bread. That's all it means, unleavened bread, okay? So we've proven this in two ways. Number one, we've proven that it's nonsensical to assume that machmetzet in verse 19 means fermented food, such as sauerkraut and yogurt, because sauerkraut and yogurt have absolutely nothing to do with the Passover story. Only leavened bread versus unleavened bread have something to do with the Passover story. And the second way we've proven it is we've proven it grammatically by taking a look at, and let me point these two out here. I'll grab this little thingy again, this drawing tool. Okay. By pointing out that in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 2, we have safachat, and in verse 6, we have mispachat. Okay, and they both mean exactly the same thing, but one has a mem before it and the other doesn't. In verse 2 without the mem, and in verse 6 with the mem. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this. And there are other examples throughout the Torah, again, where the mem does not change the meaning of the word. I don't have the list right in front of me, but when and if I come across it, I put the list somewhere. I don't remember where I put it. Then I'll certainly point it out. But the mem does not change the meaning. Let's confirm this one more time, okay, in Exodus 12 by taking a look at Robert Alter. Now, I have no idea what he's going to say. Okay, actually, I probably checked it out a couple of years ago, but I don't remember. So he's a pretty good translator, and we could also look at Everett Fox, and let's see what he has to say. Does he translate machmetzet as something different from chametz? Remember, this guy he's pretty good. He's not perfect, but he's pretty good. That's why I use him. Okay. And we're going to Exodus chapter 12. and we're comparing verses 15 and 19. So 15, he says, whoops, overshot the landing pad there. Okay, 7 days you shall eat flatbread bread. The very first day you shall expunge leaven from your houses. For whosoever eats leavened bread, okay, so he's translating that as leavened bread. That's chametz in Hebrew. That person shall be cut off from Israel from the first day to the seventh day. Okay, so that's this verse here. That's the chametz. Okay, that's verse 14. I'm sorry, verse 15. Now let's go to verse 19, where we have in Hebrew machmetzet. So 7 days, no leaven shall be found in your houses, for whosoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the community of Israel. Okay, so he changes the translation slightly, but he doesn't say anyone who eats what is fermented. He says anyone who eats what is leavened. Okay, so actually that's an excellent translation because it actually does point out a slight difference between the two, not changing the meaning, but just changing the way that meaning is expressed. So this means leavened bread, and this means machmetzet, the thing that is leavened. But they both mean the same thing. And the important thing to point out is that he doesn't translate it as eats that which is fermented. He says eats that which is leavened. The idea of leavening only applies to bread, okay? Vinegar is not leavened. Wine is not leavened. Yogurt is not leavened. Only bread is leavened. And he has a comment. Let's take a look at his comment here on verse 19. So he doesn't relate to that per se. Let's see if he says something here. No, so he doesn't have a comment per se, but that's okay. Let's go back to the actual verses. Come on, back. Do it. Oops. Again, overshot the landing pad. Okay. For whosoever eats what is leavened. Okay. Let's take a look at Everett Fox, Exodus 12. Genesis. Okay. And see what Everett Fox, again, another excellent translation, says. So we're comparing Exodus 12:15 with Exodus 12:19. So Exodus 12:15, and let's just find the relevant part. For anyone who eats what is fermented, okay, well, he says fermented, but but he's saying here that chametz means fermented. So that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? We know chametz doesn't mean anything fermented. Chametz means leavened bread. So I don't know why he chooses translation fermented, but I guess he just means fermented bread is really what he means. Let's look at what he says in 19. For 7 days, no leaven, blah, 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 forever eats what ferments. So basically, he's just calling leavened bread fermented bread, essentially, okay? He's not saying anything that's fermented, because if he were saying anything that's fermented, then he would be saying chametz. The word chametz in chapter 15 means any fermented food. But that doesn't make sense. Even the Egyptian Karaites don't claim that chametz means fermented food. They claim that chametz means leavened bread, and they claim that machmetzet means fermented food. Okay. All right. Well, he disappointed me. I don't like that translation. So we'll go back to Robert Alter. Robert Alter doesn't say anything about fermentation. Let's get rid of Everett Fox. We'll go back to Robert Alter. Okay. And Robert Alter doesn't say anything about fermentation. Robert Alter speaks only about leavening. Okay. So here in verse 15, leavened bread. And in verse 19, that which is leavened. Okay. And that for sure is the better translation for the other reasons that I mentioned. Okay. Once again, fermented foods has nothing to do with the context of the Passover story. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Any comments? Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. Any questions, any comments before we move on? Okay, so let's move on. Let me get rid of this thingy. Goodbye, red stuff. And we can get rid of Leviticus. Oh, that was Leviticus 13, Exodus 12. Okay, and let's move on. Okay. And then again, we have Kol Machmetzet Lo Tochelu B'Kol Moshvatechem Tochlu Matzot. And here's another. Okay, here's another clear proof. Clear proof. Okay, because if you want to say the word Machmetzet in verse 20 means fermented foods, what the heck does this? This verse doesn't make any sense. Okay, let's look at verse 20 and let's translate. Okay, Kol Machmetzet Lo Tochelu. So you should not eat any machmetzet, and I'll deliberately leave it untranslated for the moment. B'chol moshvatechem, throughout all of your habitations, tochlu matzot, you should eat unleavened bread. What the heck does that mean? You shall not eat any fermented foods, but throughout all your habitations, you should eat unleavened bread. Okay, if we translate machmetzet as fermented foods, that is a nonsensical. It's a non sequitur. It doesn't make sense. However, if we translate machmetzet as chametz, as leavened bread, then it makes perfect sense. Remember, we said before that chametz and matzah are, or matzot. Matzah is a singular, matzot is a plural. Doesn't matter. Chametz and matzot are polar opposites of each other, like night and day, like sun and moon, like I don't know, McDonald's and Burger King, or something like that. Okay, they're polar. They're antonyms of each other. They're contrasted with each other, and that's precisely what we see here in verse 20. Let's read verse 20 with the correct understanding that machmetzet just means leavened bread, means chametz. Then it reads, and it makes perfect sense, Kol machmetzet lo tochelu, you shall not eat any leavened bread, b'chol moshvatechem. I'm sorry, let me do this again, because we have here the atnach. This is the semicolon, so we're going to break it down into two versets, or verselets, as I like to call them. Okay, Kol machmetzet lo tochelu, you shall not eat any leavened bread, you shall not eat any chametz. Semicolon. Throughout all of your habitations, you shall eat unleavened bread. Now it makes perfect sense, right? Again, let's read it with the ridiculous translation of fermented foods and see that it doesn't. It's a non sequitur. It's not a logical verse. You shall not eat any fermented foods. Semicolon. Throughout all of your habitations, you shall eat unleavened bread. That doesn't make any sense. But now let's read it with the correct translation, where machmetzet means chametz, which means leavened bread, and then it says, "Kol machmetzet lo tochelu," you shall not eat any leavened bread. Semicolon. Throughout all your habitations, you shall eat unleavened bread. Now it makes perfect sense, and it fits into the structure of so many other verses throughout the Tanakh in which you have parallelism. Right? There could be different types of parallelism. Okay. In this case, we have opposing parallelism, or I think they call it officially antonymical parallelism, where one is contrasted to the other. Okay, so you shall not eat any leavened bread, but throughout all your habitations you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, this is a classic. This is a classic structure of parallelism within the verse, or within verses of the Torah. One is contrasted to the other. Okay, so not to belabor the point, but I'll say one more time. If we understand machmetzet in this verse as meaning fermented foods, it doesn't make sense. The only way it makes sense, and that it forms a classic verse of parallelism, of where one is contrasted with one half of the verse is contrasted with the other half of the verse, or the first half of the verse is contrasted with the second half of the verse, is if machmetzet means leavened bread. Okay, so let's read it again in the silly way. You shall not eat any yogurt. Or kol machmetzet lo techelu, you shall not eat any yogurt. I'll use yogurt as a stand-in for fermented foods. Rather, in all of your habitations, you shall eat unleavened bread. What the heck does that mean? That's ridiculous, right? Now let's read it the right way. You shall not eat any leavened bread, but in all your habitations, you shall eat unleavened bread. That makes perfect sense. Okay, so I think I've made the point. I hope it's clear. I think it's clear, and we're going to move on. Okay. Okay, so this we can skip over because this is just some of the details. this is speaking about, again, we're going back now to that first Passover sacrifice. So here, everything from here to here, actually not here. Oops, where were we? I'm sorry. Everything from here to here is speaking about the first Passover sacrifice, that original Passover sacrifice on the night that we were taken out of Egypt. From here to here is speaking about the laws of the subsequent commemoration of that Passover sacrifice, speaking specifically about the laws for Hag HaMazoth, for the festival of unleavened bread. Then we go back to some details about that first Passover sacrifice, including taking a bouquet of ezov, of hyssop. And by the way, the word hyssop comes from the word ezov. You can see ezov, hyssop, ezov, hyssop, right? And I believe that's even an admitted etymology. If you look at the etymology of the word hyssop, I think some of the etymologies will actually even admit that it comes from the Hebrew word ezov, which is very rare. Usually they don't admit it. They come up with this ridiculous Proto-Indo-European nonsense and refuse to relate it back to biblical, to relate English words of today or words from Romance languages back to biblical Hebrew. At any rate, so you take the hyssop, dip it in the blood of that original Passover sacrifice, and then rub it on the doorposts. Okay. Okay. And a person should not go out of his house until the morning. Okay. So the Israelites didn't exit in the middle of the night. What happened in the middle of the night was that the destroying angel came around and killed all the firstborn. But the Israelites did not exit in the dark. They waited until the morning. They were not allowed to leave their houses until the morning. Once the sun rose, that's when they got the heck out of Dodge. Okay. Leaving all the Egyptians with their dead firstborn behind, and taking, of course, all their gold and silver and bronze. Okay, verse 23. I'm just going to summarize here. So when Yahweh goes around, okay, he's going to see the blood on the doorposts, and he's going to, he's going to pass over. That's why we call the holiday Passover. He's going to pass over the entrance to that particular house, and he's not going to allow the destroying angel to enter into the house to destroy or to do its thing. Verse 25. Okay, and now starting here, we're going now back to what we do in subsequent years. Okay, verse 24 says, hi, everybody. Hi, Benjamin Zalma. Welcome. Verse 24, and shall keep this thing. What thing? We're going to find out in a second. As a statute for you, and your descendants, your children, ad olam, for all times. Okay? What thing? Here. This thing in verse 25. And it shall be that when you enter into the land which Yahweh gives to you, meaning, of course, the land of Israel, kasher diber, as he said to you, as he swore to you, that you shall keep this service. Okay? What service? Let's go on and find out. Ki yomru elechem banechem ma avodah azot lechem, and it shall be that when your children say to you, what is this thing you're doing? What is this service that you're keeping? Okay. Ramatim. Zevach Pesachu. You'll say, this is the Passover sacrifice. This is the Passover slaughter. Just go with Passover sacrifice. This is the Passover sacrifice. Hu li Yahweh, to Yahweh. Asher pasach al batei bnei Yisrael, because he passed over the houses of the children of Israel by Mitzrayim in Egypt, bin godfo, bin narfo, et Mitzrayim, when he slaughtered, when he took out his plague upon Egypt, but he saved our houses, he rescued our houses, and the people they bowed down and prostrated themselves. Okay, so all of this here, when we go back to, you're going to keep in the future, when you enter the land, you're going to keep the service. We find out in verse 27 what service he's talking about. Zevach Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, is what he's talking about. Okay, and the reason we keep this Passover sacrifice is to commemorate that original Passover sacrifice, because Yahweh passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt. Okay, when he slaughtered the firstborn in Egypt. Okay, verse 28. Yehuv yasu b'nei Israel kashet tziwa Yahweh et Moshe et Aaron ken asu. So the children of Israel went and did as Yahweh commanded. Moses and Aaron, so they did. What are we talking about here? We're talking about all of what was spoken about at the beginning of the chapter, because here it says, V'yomer Yahweh el Moshe ve'el Aaron. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, and then all of the laws of that original Passover sacrifice are given down to here. Okay, so we see that chapter 12 jumps back and forth between the original Passover sacrifice, or that original Passover, the year that the Israelites exited from Egypt, and laws in subsequent years. Specifically here, the laws of Hag HaMazoth, the 7 days of Hag HaMazoth, which were not kept on that original exodus from Egypt, but are only kept in subsequent years. Okay, and Pesach, then it jumps back to that original Passover, slaughter the Passover sacrifice and rub its blood on the doorposts. Okay. Okay, and then it's still staying at the original Passover until down to here, until verse 24. And then it says that in the future, when you enter the land of Israel, that you will keep what? You will keep the Zevach Passover, that you will bring a Passover sacrifice or commemorative Passover sacrifice, Zevach Pesach, each year as a way of commemorating what happened that first year with that original blood, or that original sacrifice where the blood was rubbed on the doorposts. Okay, and then the children of Israel went and did exactly as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, meaning they went and got the Passover sacrifice on the 14th day. They slaughtered it, dipped the blood in, etc. Okay, then we have the 10th plague, the plague of the death of the firstborn. This is not, it's obviously important, but we're going to skip over it because it's not relevant to what we want to talk about today. Okay. Let me see if there's anything that I want to say. Nope. Okay, let's pick it up here in verse 31. And before we do, let me ask, are there any questions or any comments? So there is a verse where Yahweh says he will go through Egypt himself to destroy the firstborn. Was a destroying angel, Yahweh directly. It was destroying. So one important thing to keep in mind is that throughout the Torah, in fact, throughout the Tanakh, that Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh are used interchangeably. Okay? And this is something that a Chacham who hasn't been in contact with me for a little while, but I have great respect for his knowledge in Torah. His name is Hakham Yaakov ben Yisrael. Used to always point out that when it speaks about an angel of Yahweh and Yahweh himself, it's used interchangeably, and essentially what it means is the angel of Yahweh. So really, when it says that Yahweh went and destroyed the firstborn, or went and killed the firstborn, it means that Yahweh did it, but he did it through the destroying angel. And we could see this throughout a lot of different narratives regarding angels. For instance, when the three angels come to visit Abraham, sometimes it'll say the visitors, and sometimes it will say Yahweh, and it'll go back and forth. Okay, the thing to keep in mind is Yahweh does not interact directly with anybody in the entire Tanakh except for one person, and that one person is Moses. Okay, Moses, Yahweh spoke to Moses as a person speaks to his friend, without any dreams or without any visions, a direct communication. Other than that, all communication was either through dreams or visions or through the intermediaries of angels. Okay, so whenever we see Yahweh said to such and such, okay, it's either in a vision or in a dream, or it's an angel that's doing the speaking on behalf of Yahweh. But sometimes it just says Yahweh, but it doesn't mean that Yahweh is speaking directly to the person. It means, what was that? Hold on a second. Excuse me for 1 second. For a cat screen. Okay. Oh, come on. Come here, you. What? You want to eat? All right. Sorry about that. We adopted a little kitten about a year ago. Well, it's not a kitten anymore. Sometimes he acts like one. Come here, baby. Come here. Come on. Come here, Shashiko. Come, sweet. Go. Okay. So all right, so that's the answer. It means the angel of Yahweh, but it can be used interchangeably. Sometimes it will say Yahweh spoke to such and such, but it really means, again, that unless it was in a vision or a dream, it means the angel is speaking on or doing on Yahweh's behalf. So the answer is, Harlan, it was the destroying angel. Yahweh didn't do it directly. He sent his messenger. It's like a king, right? Let's say a king says, I am going to, I don't know, the king of Assyria says to Hezekiah, I'm going to destroy Jerusalem, as we see in the book of Isaiah. Okay, does the king of Assyria come and destroy Jerusalem or attempt to destroy Jerusalem directly? No, we see that he sends his field commander, the head of his army. Okay, yet that field commander is acting on behalf of the king, Sancheriv, in that case. Okay, Sancheriv. So it's the same thing here. Yahweh is doing it, but he's too important. He's the boss. He doesn't do things. He tells people what to do, okay, or he tells angels what to do. So yes, it's Yahweh doing it, but he's not doing it directly. He's doing it by sending his emissary, his envoy, and that in this case is going to be what's called the Mashchit, the destroying angel. Okay, hope that makes sense. All right, let's move on. All right, the Exodus begins. We are in Exodus chapter 12. Wow, it's getting late. I'll go for about another half an hour at most, and then we'll end. Okay. Verse 31, Vayikram leMoshe leAaron laila. So this is now Pharaoh basically kicking the Israelites out. Avdu et Yahweh ki daberchem. גם צאנכם וגם בקרכם קחו כאשר דיברתם אליכו וברכתם גם אותי. I'm going to skip all of this part because, again, it's not relevant to what we're learning right here. Okay. Oh, okay. This is very relevant. Okay. Let's pick it up here. Verse 34 is what we want to focus on. But we'll just pick it up in 33 for a little bit of context. So, ותחזק מצרים על העם למהר. So Egypt pressed strongly upon the nation, upon the people, meaning the people of Israel. The Maher. 1 second, please. Okay. Okay, sorry about that interruption. So Egypt pressed the people strongly, meaning pressed the people of Israel strongly in the Maher, and to hurry and get the heck out of there, or to hurry and send them away. Mina Aretz, from the land of Egypt. Ki amru kulanu metim, because they said we're all going to die. Right? They see the firstborn are dying, and they don't know it's just the firstborn. How do they know? Right? So they think it's going to be all of them. We're all dead, right? We're all going to be dead if these people don't get the heck out of here. Okay, so they've had enough of Israel. They've realized that the power of Israel, that living within them, the destruction that keeping Israel has wrought upon them, right? And time to go. Okay, verse 34. So this is very important to our discussion today. We saw ha'am et batzeko terem hamatz mish'arotam sirurot b'simrotam and shichmam. Okay, so the people picked up or took along with them et batzeko, their dough. Okay, terem yachmatz, before it had a chance to rise. And we'll pick this apart a little bit more in a second. Mish'arotam tzururot b'simrotam, with their kneading troughs wrapped in their clothing, wrapped in their robes, al shichmam, on their shoulders. Okay, so let's see if we can even get a picture of this, maybe. Okay, their kneading troughs wrapped in their clothing. So this is what we're talking about. Let's see. I don't know. Maybe we'll get lucky and there'll be a picture of it. I guess not. If not, you get the idea. Okay. So they have these robes. No, nothing. Okay. So the Israelites. Okay, so let's just back up and see what it's saying here. Volky, the cat, he's gonna pee. Okay, he's walking down the hallway. Okay. Well, I don't know. I'm busy now. We saw Amit Batseko. So the people, they took their dough before it had a chance to rise. So how did they take it? They put it in their kneading bowls. Okay. So where do you make bread? Okay, you take the dough, you take the sourdough starter, you knead it all together, and you let it sit and you let it rise. Right. Anyone who's made bread, and even if you haven't made bread, you know that you have to leave the dough for a while to let it rise before you bake it. Okay. So this is saying that the Israelites were rushing so quickly out of Egypt that they didn't have time to let their dough rise. And what they did is they put the dough before it rose, or as it was rising, but before it had a chance to rise, they put it in their bowls, in their kneading bowls, basically in these giant bowls. And then they put the bowls up on their shoulders and they wrapped the bowls in their clothing. Why did they wrap the bowls in their clothing? Well, they didn't want the insects, the birds, whatever, to pick at it. They wanted to keep it protected, right? Just like today, if you let dough rise, anyone who's made bread at home, you know that if you let dough rise, you're going to cover it. You cover it with plastic, or you cover it with a plate, or whatever you use. Okay, because you don't want the insects to get in there, you don't want animals to get in there, right? You want to keep it safe. So same thing here, but the point is that what we see in verses 33 and 34 is that the people of Israel were rushed out of Egypt so much. Okay, Egypt was scared, sh-less of what was going to happen to them. So they hurried the people of Israel out of Egypt, and so therefore the bread that they had been preparing didn't even have a chance to rise, and they basically ran out of Egypt with their unleavened bread on their shoulders. Okay, in the bowls on their shoulders. Okay, why is this so important? Because this is the second reason that we eat matzot for 7 days, commemorating the original Exodus from Egypt. Okay, we said that in the Torah sometimes there are multiple reasons for things that we do, or sometimes there are multiple sources or multiple reasons given for why a name such as Beersheba is given. We spoke about that earlier. Okay, in this case, we saw one reason before why we eat unleavened bread, matzot, for 7 days, and that is because, where was it? I don't remember the exact verse now. 1 second. Here it is. No. 1 second. I can't find the exact verse right now, but we saw it before. And the first reason is that we were commanded to eat that original Passover sacrifice with matzot and mirorim, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. That's number one reason that we have a 7-day festival each year where we eat unleavened bread, because the original Passover sacrifice was eaten along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Okay? The second reason is given here. The second reason is given in verse 34, that the Israelites had to rush so quickly out of Egypt that there was no time for their dough to rise. In other words, for their dough to turn into chametz, that they ran out with the dough before it had a chance to rise on their shoulders, wrapped in their clothing. And as we shall see, we'll get to it in a second, when they got out into the desert, they took that dough and they made unleavened bread. They made matzot out of that dough. Okay, so that's reason number two. That's the second connection between the original Exodus story, the actual Exodus, and unleavened bread. Okay, right here in Exodus chapter 12, verse 34. All right, let's move on. And again, I'm only going to focus on the verses which are relevant to what we're talking about today, but I'll read the Hebrew for now. So this is not relevant. I'm going to skip over this. We'll pick it up in verse 37. So the children of Israel traveled from Ramses. Remember, they were building the two the two usually translated storage cities of Pitom and Ramses. Okay, so that's where they were living, around those areas. So they traveled to Sukkot, to the city of Sukkot, or to the area of Sukkot. Approximately 600,000 men on foot, not including the children. Verse 38, Ragam, Erev Rav Allah itam utzon ubakar mikneh kaved ma'od, and also here we have the Erev Rav. We won't get into that right now. Okay, this is what we want to get to. We want to get to verse 39. Yofu et habasek asher hotziu mimitzrayim rot masot ki lo hametz ki goreshu mimitzrayim velo yachlu litmameh v'gam seda lo asu lahem. Okay, so verse 39 says they baked the dough. What dough? That dough that was on their shoulders, wrapped in their clothing as they ran out of Dodge, when they got the heck out of Dodge finally after hundreds and hundreds of years, okay, that they baked this dough, asher otziu mimitzrayim, that they had taken out of Egypt, ugot matzot. They baked it into loaves of matzah, of matzot, of unleavened bread. Okay, there's a lot to say about this verse, but the first thing we want to say is that we see that this is another reason, it's the same reason as in the previous verse, right? That the bread did not have time, the bread that they had prepared in Egypt did not have time to rise, okay? And so when they got out into the desert, when they got out of Egypt, okay, on their way to Sukkot, then they took that dough and they made unleavened bread. They made matzot, they made matzah out of it. Okay, so that's this story of the Israelites not having time or having to get out of Egypt so quickly that the dough didn't have time to rise, and so therefore it didn't have time to turn into chametz. And so when they got into the desert, they cooked it into loaves of unleavened bread, into loaves of matzot. This is a second connection between the Exodus of Egypt and the reason that we eat unleavened bread for 7 days. In other words, what we're trying to say here, or what this commemorates, is the hipazon. Okay, where was that word? We saw it exactly. Uh-oh, we're frozen. Oh, shoot. This happens. I'm sorry, I don't know why it happens. But once every study, for some strange reason, Chrome freezes, and I'll give it a second to unfreeze. If not, I'm just going to have to shut down the computer, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. I have no other choice. I think it's frozen. Now that stupid beach ball is going to start turning around. Yeah. Let me give it one more second. If not, I'll have to go out and I'll have to come back in. I think you guys can hear me. That's usually what's happened in the past, but I don't think anything is working correctly enough from my end. Okay, I'm going to shut the computer. You guys can just talk among yourselves, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Okay, everyone, we're back. Let me do a sound check. Sorry about that. There's nothing I can do about it. It just happens when I use a streaming service called StreamYard. Then it doesn't interact well with Chrome for some reason, and they've never solved the problem. So usually about once a study, it freezes, and it's completely beyond my control. There's nothing I can do about it. I just have to shut down the computer and restart it. Okay, can I do a sound check? Can you guys hear me okay? Sound check, somebody? Okay, cool. All right, awesome. Okay, so let's go on. Where were we? Yeah, right. So they get out into the desert and they cook it into matzot. So here's our second connection between the Exodus story and unleavened bread and matzot. First connection was that on that original Passover sacrifice, the Israelites ate that original sacrifice, the meat of that original sacrifice, together with matzot and mirorim and bitter herbs. Second connection is that the Israelites were hurried out of Egypt so quickly by the Egyptians who saw their firstborn dying and thought they were all going to die, that there was no time for the dough to rise. And so it stayed unleavened, wasn't enough time to leaven, wasn't enough time to rise. And so it stayed unleavened. And when they got out into the desert, they took that dough and they cooked it into matzah. They cooked it into unleavened bread. So we see two connections between the Exodus story now and the festival of unleavened bread that we keep each year, right, for 7 days. So when we eat unleavened bread, we're supposed to remember a number of different things. Number one, we're supposed to remember that original Passover sacrifice, which was eaten with unleavened bread. And number two, we're supposed to remember how quickly we had to get the heck out of Dodge because the Egyptians were so terrified of us at that point that they just hurried us out. Get out of here. Get out. Get out. Out, 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 out. Okay? So that's what we're supposed to think of when we eat matzot. And there's also one other connection that if we have time, we'll talk about, and that is that matzah is called Tanach-only, usually translated as poor man's bread or the bread of affliction. And it's supposed to remind us, because it's unleavened, okay, because it is an unleavened bread is not as good tasting or as soft and nice as leavened bread, as regular bread, as we all know. Certainly by the time the seventh day of Passover rolls around, we all can't wait to get back to our pizzas and our hamburgers and our bagels and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's supposed to be Tanach-only, the bread of affliction, and it's supposed to remind us of the affliction that the Egyptians put us through when they enslaved us and when they basically turned us into servants or into slaves, and put us into hard labor to make bricks and build the storage cities of Ramses and of Pitom and Ramses, right? So there are multiple connections. As we've said, the Torah will also often give multiple connections. For instance, in Shabbat, there are multiple reasons given throughout the Torah why we keep the Shabbat. Number one reason is to commemorate the seventh day that Yahweh rested after creating the earth, the heavens and the earth for 6 days. Number two reason that's given is that it's in order that the underdogs in society, the potentially the downtrodden, or those that can potentially be taken advantage of in society, are guaranteed 1 day of rest each week. And if you don't know how important that is, look at the United States of America right now, where people have to work at 3 jobs and they have to work at Target on Christmas. I can't stand Christmas, but it is a family holiday in the United States where they have to work on Thanksgiving, right? They're not given even a day of rest where they have time to spend with their families, okay? And where they have time to just take a break. Okay, they're constantly running around. What do they call it? Hustling, okay, to make ends meet, and even then they can't make ends meet. So the Torah guarantees that the poor, the indigent, the downtrodden, the manservant, the maidservant, the slave, the male and female slaves, even the animals will get a day of rest once a week, and that is the Shabbat. Okay, you are not allowed to work in order so that these the underclass, the people in Israelite society who could potentially easily be taken advantage of, are also given a day off. You can't overwork them. Okay, so that's multiple reasons that were given for keeping the Shabbat, and here we have multiple reasons that were given for eating unleavened bread for 7 days. Okay, let's move on. Any questions? Any comments? If not, let's move on. Okay. So that's it. We read verse 39. Okay, I'll read it one more time. I'll read it and translate it one more time. And they baked the dough which they had taken out of Egypt, ugot matzot, into cakes of matzah, into loaves of matzah, kilo hametz, because it didn't have time to rise, ki gorshumi mitzrayim, because they were kicked out of Egypt, velo yachlu litmameh, and they couldn't hang around any longer. They couldn't delay. V'gam seda lo asu lahem, and that's already not relevant to the matzah. Okay. All right, we're going to continue on now. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that distraction. Okay, all right, let's move on. That's interesting, but not relevant. And these are the laws, more laws of the Passover sacrifice, which are fascinating, but again, not relevant to our discussion today. So let's move on now to chapter 13. Okay. And let's see if there's anything we want to say here in chapter 13. This is what's called Pidyon Ben. And again, very fascinating stuff, as it all is, but not relevant to what we want to talk about today. Let me just see. Okay, this is important. So we're going to pick it up here in Exodus chapter 3. I'm sorry, Exodus chapter 13, verse 3. And I'm going to end pretty soon here. But let's do a couple more things. So verse 3, Wayomer Moshe el Am. So Moses said to the people, remember this day asher yatzata mitzrayim. Remember this day which you came out of Egypt, that you left Egypt. Which day? The Israelites left Egypt on the morning of the 15th day of the first month. Okay, let's get the time schedule in perspective here. Okay, the sun sets on the 14th day. Remember, Jewish days, Israelite days begin after sunset. Then there's an intermediary period called what we call in English evening, what I like to call the mixing time. It's not quite day, it's not quite night. So that's the mixing time between the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th. Depending on the context in the Torah, it can be referred to as the 14th in the mixing, the 14th or the 15th, okay, since it's between one and the other. So once again, the sun sets on the 14th, okay? That's when you're supposed to now bring the Passover sacrifice between the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th, and that mixing time and that evening between the 14th and the 15th. Then the 15th starts during that mixing time. By the time it's maximum darkness, it's already definitely the 15th day of the first month. At midnight, the destroying angel goes around and kills all the firstborn of the Egyptians. Okay, the Israelites are not allowed to leave their house. They stay in their houses. They're not allowed to leave their houses until the morning of the 15th. Okay, in the morning, they get the heck out of Dodge. They go out into the desert. It's on the 15th day of the first month. And so this is the day on which they exited Egypt. They exited Egypt on the morning of the 15th day of the first month. The previous evening after the sunset, that's when they took the Passover sacrifice and slaughtered it and rubbed its blood on their doorposts. And that's when each year we're supposed to bring the commemorative Passover sacrifice. And then right after that, we're supposed to start 7 days of eating only unleavened bread. Okay. So verse 3, Wayomer Moshe el Am zachoret hayom hazeh. So remember this day. What day? Asher yatzatem mitzrayim, the day on which you went out of Egypt. What day did the Israelites go out of Egypt? The morning of the 15th. Mibeit avadim, from the slave pits, from the slave house. Ki b'chozek yad, Because with a strong hand, Yahweh took you out of that place, and leavened bread should not be eaten. Okay, starting on that day, on the 15th. Today, you are going out in what month? The month of the Aviv. We saw in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, that this month of the Aviv, this month in which they're going out of Egypt, is the first month of the year. Let's look at that again. Exodus chapter 12, verse 2. Okay. This month shall be for you the head of the months. It is the first month among the months of the year. Okay, so this first month of the year, this is the month that we exited Egypt. This is what is now being called here the month of the Aviv, Chodesh HaAviv. What is Aviv? As we said before, Aviv is basically the month in which the barley is almost ripe. I won't go into the technical details right now, but it's the month in which the barley is close to being completely ripe. Not quite 100% ripe, but almost ripe. Okay, and we as Karaites, we look for the Aviv barley. We'll look for the almost ripe barley, and once we find Aviv barley abundant throughout the land of Israel, then the following new moon, that is now declared the month of the Aviv, and that is now declared the first month of the new year. And in that month is when we celebrate the Passover, the Hag HaMazoth, the festival of unleavened bread. And if we had an altar on the Temple Mount, is when we would bring the Passover sacrifice. Okay. I might skip this. Okay, so when you come into the land of Israel, you shall keep this service in this month. What service? We're going to find out. Okay, colon. The colon doesn't mean look ahead, but in this case, we can use it to say that we're talking about the next verse. What service do we keep when we come into the land of Israel? Shivat yamim tochal matzot. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. And on the 7th day is a festival to Yahweh. For 7, matzot yechel et shivat yamim. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for these 7 days. V'lo yira'eh. So it's basically a repetition of what we saw in the previous chapter. Lo yira'eh lecha chametz v'lo yira'eh lecha seor b'chol gvulecha. And leavened bread and sourdough starter, leavening agent, yeast, shall not be seen throughout, throughout all of your borders. And the fact that here it uses shall not be seen, lo yira'eh, and in chapter 12 it said lo yimatzeh, shall not be found, once again implies to me that you don't actually have to 100% destroy it. It's preferable to destroy it, but if you can't, then just hide it away. Just put it out of sight, out of mind, as they say. Okay, and this goes for chametz as well as or, but you do not have to sell it to a goy. That's just a ridiculous legalistic loophole and a legalistic hoop that rabbinical Jews jump through. It's silly. It actually makes I think light of the whole thing that we're supposed to do. It's just stupid and embarrassing, quite frankly. Okay. Verse 8, and you shall tell your son on that day, tell your children on that day. On what day? On that first day that you're coming out of Egypt. So this is a commandment, or on the commemoration of that first day that you're coming out of Egypt. In other words, on the 15th of the first month. So this is a commandment to tell your children, to relate to your children this great thing that Yahweh did for our ancestors, that he vanquished this superpower, this leading superpower, Egypt, and took this piddling little nation, Israel. Well, it was 600,000 by this time, but what started as a piddling little nation of 70 people, okay, and then now turned into 6,000, took us miraculously out of Egypt and destroyed one of the world's superpowers at the time. And this is what we're supposed to tell to our children each year, so that it's not forgotten. It's passed from generation to generation. And so that we remember the great things that Yahweh did to us in the past. And maybe I'll talk about something very interesting in a second, if I can, in the book of Jeremiah. But let's continue here for a second. Okay. So you got to lebincha b'yomahu. So you should relate to your children on that day. On what day? The day that we're commemorating, that first day we went out of Egypt. In other words, on the 15th day of the first month. That's why we have the Passover Seder. The rabbis have done quite a number on the Passover Seder, but we're supposed to tell our children on that day the story of our stay in Egypt, and in particular our exodus, our miraculous exodus from Egypt at the hand of Yahweh with his signs and wonders and his strong hand and his outstretched arm. And here we have the word vihigadata, you shall relate or you shall tell the story of to your children. And that's where we get the word Haggadah from. It comes directly from Exodus chapter 13, verse 8. Vihigadata levincha b'yomahu. So you shall relate the story to your children on that day. And that's where we get the word Haggadah. The Haggadah means the telling of the story of, in parentheses, of Passover. Vihigadata Haggadah. Okay. That being said, let me remind everybody that that there is a Passover Haggadah that I made. It's completely free. You can download it for no cost whatsoever. It's in PDF format. You can print it out, and I will put the link right here. Okay. So there it is. That's the Passover Haggadah that I made. And do this one instead. Okay. And if you follow that link, it's also in the comments. Then you're welcome to use that Passover Haggadah for your own Seder. I guess it's too late this year, but for next year. Okay. And maybe I should also I'll pop the instructions in the comments if it can take the whole thing. Let's see here. Let me just put this in the comments. That'll work. Okay. So there you go. Oops, I don't want to do that. All right, you can see it in the comments. I don't know if it showed the whole comment. At any rate, you have the link, okay? All right. So where was we? Right. So igata levincha b'yomahu, so you shall relate to your children on that day. On what day? On that day when we exited Egypt, on the first day, on the 15th day of the first month. Lemor, and tell them, and say to them, Ba'avur zeh asa Yahweh li b'tzeti mimitzrayim. Okay, because of this, because of what Yahweh did for me when I went out of Egypt. In other words, this is why we're doing all of this stuff. Okay, it's because of what Yahweh did for us when he caused me to exit out of Egypt. Okay, and of course, then the rabbis play on that verse to the four sons because of what he did for me and not for you, and blah blah blah. Okay, all right, verse 9. This is important, and maybe we'll end here. Well, we'll go a little bit more. And it shall be for you a sign on your hands and as a remembrance between your eyes. So this is clearly talking about tefillin, right? Wrong. This is absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with tefillin. What does this have to do with tefillin? What is it talking about? What is the context here? Okay, the context here is what? Okay, let's go back a little bit. It's talking about Vayaki the whole context here is okay. You shall keep this service in this month for 7 days. You shall eat matzot. That's what's the context. That's what the context is here. And this shall be for you as a sign on your hands and as a memorial between your eyes. What shall be for you as a sign on your hands and a memorial between your eyes? The keeping of the Hag HaMazoth, the keeping of the festival of unleavened bread. This is the sign. Okay, it's not boxes that you place on your hand and between your eyes. The keeping of the 7-day festival of Hag HaMazoth, that is the sign. Okay, that is a sign. This is a phrase. This is an expression that the Torah uses in various different contexts to say that by doing such and such, it's a sign that we're keeping the service of Yahweh, that we're doing what Yahweh commanded us to commemorate. In this case, the Exodus from the land of Egypt. This has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with tefillin. It doesn't even make sense. Okay, the whole context here is the 7-day festival of Hag HaMazoth. Keeping the 7-day festival of Hag HaMazoth, that is the sign on our hands and the remembrance between our eyes. And by the way, pay attention here, that doesn't say totafot. It says zikaron, which implies, first of all, that the word totafot probably is the same as zikaron or similar to the word zikaron. And zikaron means a commemoration or remembrance. And it's clear from the context here that what are we remembering? What are we commemorating? We're commemorating that day, that actual day when we exited, or that actual exodus from Egypt. And by keeping the festival of Hag HaMazoth, by keeping the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days, that is a sign on our hands and a remembrance, a commemoration of what? Of the exodus from Egypt between our eyes. Okay, once again, this has nothing to do with tefillin. Tefillin are completely 1000% a rabbinical invention that didn't even exist until the Second Temple period, until the middle, if not late Second Temple, well, I'll say middle Second Temple period, when the Pharisees became prominent and their distorted reform version of Torah became prominent among the people of Israel. Okay, this is speaking not about tefillin, not about placing stupid black boxes on your arm and on your head. This is speaking about keeping the 7 days of Hag HaMazoth, the 7 days of unleavened bread, of eating unleavened bread for 7 days as a sign. A sign is something visible that other people around you will see. The 4 questions: why do we eat matzot, right? Why are we eating matzot? Why are we allowed to eat any kind of bread on every other days, but on these days we're only allowed to eat unleavened bread? This is a sign. This is something that other people will see, and it will serve as a reminder. It will serve as a something that causes questions to be asked of what's going on here. The answer being because Yahweh took us out of Egypt. Okay. All right. So that's that. All right. So it's going to be a sign on your hands or on your arm and a remembrance between your eyes. What? The keeping of Passover, of not eating leavened bread for 7 days. In order that the instructions of Yahweh will be in your mouth. Okay, the ways or the directives of Yahweh will be in your mouth. Because with a strong hand, Yahweh took you out of Egypt. Again, the context here is the exodus from Egypt. Okay, by keeping the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days, by not eating leavened bread for 7 days, we create a sign for our children, for our families, for all of the nation of Israel, for all the entire world, that we are commemorating this great thing that Yahweh did for us thousands of years ago when he took us, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt. That's the sign, the eating of matzot for 7 days, or the refraining from eating leavened bread for 7 days, right? It's going to cause questions to be asked, such as when the rabbis do the 4 questions in their Passover Haggadah. Okay, verse 10. And you'll keep this law in its correct time from year to year. What law? Eating only unleavened bread for 7 days in its correct time. What is its correct time? Starting on the 15th day of the first month. Okay, when the day on which we exited from Egypt. Yes, it was in the morning, but the day, the 15th, starts the evening before, after the bringing of the Passover sacrifice. This is what we're going to keep from year to year, okay, as a sign on our hands and as a commemoration between our eyes, so that we'll see, our children will see, our families will see, our neighbors will see, the entire nation of Israel will see, the entire world will see that we are commemorating this great thing that Yahweh did for us so many thousands of years ago. And that's what's going on here, okay? All right, let's move ahead a little bit, and then we're going to end. Okay, so this is now Pidyon Ben. Okay, so this is not relevant. Let's see if there's anything here that I want to talk about. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so this has to do with the Pidyon Ben. שכן ויהרוג יהוה כל בכור בארץ מצרים, בכור באדם והבכור בעיני. Okay, so it's not actually Pidyon Ben. It is, one second, פת השגר בהמה, אשר יהיה לך הזכרים ליהוה, בכל פת החמור תפתה בשה ולא תפתה. Okay, okay, yes, it is Pidyon Ben. It's the redemption of the firstborn, and it's also the redemption of the firstborn animals. Again, this is the way that we remember what Yahweh did is that final plague that finally broke the back of Egypt, broke the back of this leading superpower in the ancient world, and caused them not just to allow Israel to leave, but to basically hurry them out of there. Get out, get out of our house. You're destroying us. We're all going to die. Okay? That's the miracle that Yahweh performed. And so the firstborn belongs to him. And then that's a whole story in and of itself. There's redemption of the firstborn. And we see a little bit of it here. And then ultimately the firstborn are redeemed for the Levites. The firstborn belong to Yahweh. So it really should be the firstborn that is serving as the priests and as the helpers to the priests. But then there's a switcheroo. There's an old little switcheroo where all of the firstborn are redeemed in exchange for the Levites. And that's spoken about later in the Torah. We're not going to get into it here. And then we get out, and now Israel's already out in the desert, and then we have the pillars of cloud and fire. Okay? So we're going to end it here. It's been almost 3 hours. Well, a little bit less because we did music at the beginning. But we're going to end it here. And before we do, I will ask, are there any questions? Are there any comments? So what we didn't really speak about is foods that are permitted and foods that are not permitted. So let me just sum that up very quickly. Look at the ingredients. If a food does not contain concentrated leavening agent, which usually means in this day and age, the three most common types are either yeast, baking powder, or baking soda, okay? Then chances are 99% chance that it is not leavened bread, okay? The only thing that's forbidden for these 7 days is leavened bread. You're allowed to eat. I didn't even have it. Oh, shoot. I didn't have it presented correctly. Darn it. It doesn't matter now. Waffle mix usually has you have to look at it, but usually it's going to have baking powder mixed in. I didn't even, shoot. You weren't even seeing the verses. That really sucks. It doesn't matter. Guys, if I do that in the future where I forget to present the verses again on the screen, please tell me, okay? So waffle mix, again, check the ingredients, but waffle mix usually self-rising flour, which means it usually has baking powder added in, okay? Some things that are permitted on the 7 days of Hag HaMazoth, which will come as a surprise to people, I mentioned pasta, okay, unless it's some real weird specialty pasta, which for some reason is using leavened dough, then it's permitted on Hag HaMazoth. Another common one would be nacho chips, for instance, like Doritos. Well, I don't know about Doritos because they include all kinds of crazy things. But if it's just regular plain nacho chips, which is basically corn flour and oil and salt, nothing leavened in there. Nacho chips are fine. If you like nachos and cheese, like I do, you can make your nachos and cheese. Popcorn, any kitniot is totally fine. Rice, popcorn, anything along those lines. What else? Any fermented foods, of course, you can eat. We showed how ridiculous the idea of fermented foods being forbidden on Hag HaMazoth is. So yogurt, sauerkraut, mayonnaise, anything you like, you can eat regarding fermented foods. Again, the only thing we want to avoid is leavened bread. That's what's forbidden. Leavened bread. Nothing more, nothing less. Not fermented foods, not unleavened bread, okay? I could even go into a gray area where you might have some products that use deactivated yeast for flavoring. So they'll use nutritional yeast. Nutritional yeast is deactivated. But unless you really know, your food ingredients, okay? Unless you really know the process of how food is made, I would just avoid anything that says yeast, that says baking powder, that says baking soda. And there are some less common forms of leavening agent, but those are the three most common. I think it was posted on the WhatsApp group, a link to leavening agents. Let me just find it. a second. Let's see if I can find it. 1 second. Is this it? No. Karaites. No. I can't find it right now. But if you look up, if you Google, let's say, leavening agents or what are common leavening agents, then you'll get a list. But those are the three most common. And sometimes baking soda is called sodium bicarbonate. Baking powder is usually just called baking powder. Yeast, it'll just say yeast. Sometimes it'll just say leavening agent. If you see anything that says leavening agent, then of course you have to avoid it. Okay. And when in doubt, leave it out. If you're not sure what an ingredient is, if you're not sure whether it's a leavening agent or not, then don't take a chance if you think it might be a leavening agent. Okay. If you think something has bread, okay, or bread crumbs in it, or is incorporated in bread, here I'll give you an example of something that I saw yesterday. We have ice cream, which is strawberry cheesecake ice cream. Okay, so you might think, okay, that's what could be kosher for, not kosher for Passover, and strawberry cheesecake ice cream, right? Except it contains little chunks of cheesecake. Okay, now cheesecake is usually made, the crust for cheesecake or the crust for pies is usually not leavened. Okay, when you make a pie crust, you usually do not add a leavening agent to it. You basically just you take flour, you take a little bit of water, and you take some kind of oil, whether it's butter or some other type of oil, and then you roll that out into what's called a shortbread. It usually doesn't contain any kind of leavening agent, but who knows? Maybe it could. So that's the kind of thing that you have to be a little bit careful of. You have to read the ingredients carefully, and you have to see, does it contain a leavening agent? Okay, and if it does, unless you really know how that leavening agent is used, and unless you really know what the ingredients on various foods mean, then again, when in doubt, leave it out. But things, again, that are commonly thought of being forbidden on Passover, such as pasta, such as nacho chips, such as popcorn, such as, I'm trying to think of some other examples. Actually, let me open up this one document that I have, and we'll end with this. Oh gosh, it's late. Where is it? I can't even find it now. Maybe this is it. No, that's the Haggadah. I can't find it now. I'm sorry, guys. And I want to end. It's late. Okay, but use your common sense. Okay, and unless something is actually leavened bread, then you're allowed to eat on Hag HaMazoth. Okay. All right. Any final questions? Any final comments before we end it? No? Going once? Going twice? Going thrice? Okay. If not, then I appreciate you guys joining me for this Karaite Hag HaMazoth study. Chocolate is totally fine. Unless it's chocolate with, let's say, okay, so yesterday I had to throw out, it was kind of like a strawberry cheesecake chocolate. It was chocolate, but in it had like little bits of, I wasn't sure if it was flour or not. And I'd actually thrown out the ingredients. I'd thrown out the wrapping, and I said, wow, maybe it's like little chunks of like cheesecake dough in it. And I don't know, is that dough leavened? Throw it out. Okay, but regular chocolate, no problem whatsoever. If it's just typical regular chocolate, even if it has almonds, right? By the way, nuts are completely okay. Beans are completely okay. All that kitniot stuff. Even some of the rabbinites are now starting to wake up to the idea that kitniot is a ridiculous stringency, ridiculous restriction. But as long as it doesn't have in it, chunks of dough, like you want to avoid, what is it, Ben and Jerry's cookie dough, chocolate, what is it called? Chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream or something like that. That for sure you want to avoid, right? But other than that, read the ingredients and use some common sense. And when in doubt, leave it out. And if you make a mistake, don't beat yourself up, okay? Because at least we're trying. And as long as you're trying to play it safe as much as possible, you should be good to go, okay? All right, everybody, we'll end here. I'm not going to go out with music because it's already a little bit late. And Be'ezarat Yahweh, we will see you for our regular Shabbat Torah study, which we have every Shabbat. And that's it. I wish you all a Hag HaMazoth Sameach. I hope you had all a nice Passover Seder if that's what you did. And remember, these 7 days, we're using this as a sign to show ourselves, our children, our families, all of the nation of Israel, and all the entire world that we are remembering and we're commemorating this great thing that Yahweh did for us so many thousands of years ago, that even thousands and thousands of years later, we still remember it and we still commemorate it. How many other nations can say that they've been celebrating a holiday for 3,500 years? I can't even think of one. I don't know, maybe the Zoroastrians or something like that. And if so, they're probably not taking it too seriously. Okay, so let's use these 7 days as a ot al yadenu, as a zikaron ben enenu, as a sign on our hands and a remembrance between our eyes. Okay, figuratively speaking, to show the entire world that we have not forgotten, but yet we have remembered after all these thousands of years these great things, these signs and wonders, and this strong hand and this outstretched arm that Yahweh did to perform a miracle by destroying the leading superpower, or one of the leading superpowers of its time, and taking this insignificant little nation, taking it from 70 people, growing into 600,000 people, and then allowing them to walk out of Egypt with the wealth of Egypt like kings, turning from slaves into kings. This is the greatness of Yahweh. With Yahweh on our side, we fear. Who is it that we should fear, right? If we are with Yahweh, there's nothing or is no one that we should fear. He can do anything he wants. If we are loyal to him, then he will perform great miracles for us, as he did for our ancestors 3,500 years ago. So with that, I wish everybody a Hag HaMazoth Sameach, a happy festival of unleavened bread, and we'll see you again soon. Okay? Maybe I'll go out with one song.
אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ, אל ייתן לה שיר לה שיר למעלות, אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם.
All right, everybody. The sound isn't working, so I'm just going to end it here. So once again, Chag HaMazoth Sameach. Speak to you soon.